Imagine a world where the fate of empires didn't hinge on massive armies or grand battles, but on a single whispered conversation in a darkened corridor. A world where a carefully passed note could determine the future of nations, and where the right secret in the right hands could rewrite the maps of entire continents. This wasn't the plot of a fantasy novel. This was the reality of medieval Europe, a shadowy realm of espionage where spies operated in the darkness yet shaped history in the light. These covert agents moved through courts and battlefields, monasteries and marketplaces, gathering intelligence that would alter the course of events for centuries to come. Their stories remain some of history's most fascinating yet overlooked chapters, filled with danger, cunning, and breathtaking audacity. In this video, we're going to uncover 23 astonishing instances where medieval spies didn't just observe history, they actively created it. From the Norman conquest that transformed England forever to the fall of Constantinople that reshaped the balance between East and West, these operatives worked in the background, pulling strings and shifting destinies. We'll explore how a betrayed secret led to William the Conqueror's victory at Hastings, how Eleanor of Aquitaine's intelligence network protected her power across two nations, and how Ottoman spies found the weakness in walls that had stood impregnable for 1,000 years. These aren't just tales of intrigue, they're pivotal moments that determined which languages we speak, which borders exist on our maps, and which powers rose to dominate the world. What makes these stories so compelling isn't just the drama and danger, it's how they mirror the espionage of our own time. The methods may have evolved from hidden messages to encrypted digital communications, but the fundamental game remains the same. Information is power, and those who control it shape reality itself. As we journey through these 23 history-altering episodes, you'll discover how medieval spies used disguise, deception, and sheer nerve to change everything from royal successions to religious reformations. So settle in and prepare to enter a world where truth was often stranger than fiction, where a single spy's report could mean the difference between a kingdom's survival and its collapse, and where the quietest whispers truly did change the world. To truly grasp the impact of these covert operatives, we need to step into their world, a fractured landscape of shifting loyalties and immense danger. The medieval period was not a single, unified era but a complex tapestry of feudal domains, each with its own ruler, its own army, and its own secrets. In this climate, information was a currency more valuable than land or titles. Knowing an enemy's troop movements, the health of a rival king, or the discontent simmering in a distant province could offer an advantage that sheer military force could not. Survival for both individuals and entire kingdoms often depended on who knew what first, making the spy not a peripheral figure, but a central pillar of power. Who were these shadowy individuals? They rarely fit the romantic image of a lone, swashbuckling agent. Instead, they were most often people whose everyday lives granted them perfect camouflage. Merchants were ideal spies. Their constant travel between regions provided a legitimate reason to cross borders, their carts and packs offering endless hiding places for coded letters. Monks and priests were equally invaluable, as the Church's network of monasteries and abbeys formed one of the most sophisticated communication systems of the age, and their sacred vows often granted them unimpeded access to the highest and lowest levels of society. Even disaffected nobles, bitter over a perceived slight or hungry for a rival's power, could be persuaded to betray secrets from within the inner circles of court. Without satellites, wiretaps, or digital encryption, their trade was one of pure human cunning. Messages were encoded in complex ciphers, hidden inside hollowed-out staffs, or even baked into loaves of bread. Disguises were essential. A soldier might pose as a pilgrim, a noble as a common beggar. The most successful spies were masters of building networks of trust, cultivating sources who could be bribed, blackmailed, or convinced to share a crucial piece of information. Their work influenced every major event, from the negotiating table where royal marriages were arranged to the battlefield where the fate of nations was decided. Their greatest weapon was not a dagger, but a carefully whispered secret, proving that in the game of empires, knowledge was the ultimate power. Now, let's zoom in on our first breathtaking example of medieval espionage in action, a story that begins with a crown, a claim, and a carefully timed whisper that would echo for 1,000 years. The year was 1066, and England was a prize caught between two powerful men. On one side stood Harold Godwinson, the newly crowned Anglo-Saxon king, ruling from a throne he had seized after the death of Edward the Confessor. On the other side waited William, Duke of Normandy, across the English Channel, absolutely convinced that Edward had promised that very throne to him. William wasn't just preparing for a simple invasion, he was orchestrating a meticulously planned takeover, and he knew that brute force alone would not be enough to overcome Harold's defenses. He needed an advantage, something that would tilt the odds in his favor. That advantage would not come from a superior army or better weapons, but from the shadowy work of agents already operating deep within Harold's own court. These Norman spies, whose names are lost to history but whose impact is undeniable, were likely a mix of disgruntled Anglo-Saxon nobles and clever Norman sympathizers who had embedded themselves within the English king's inner circle. Their mission was deceptively simple yet incredibly dangerous: gather every possible piece of intelligence on Harold's military strength, the loyalty of his earls, and the overall morale of the Saxon forces. They would have listened intently to conversations in crowded halls, taken note of supply routes, and perhaps even counted the number of ships in harbors. Most crucially, they were watching and waiting for a moment of vulnerability. That moment arrived when news broke that Harold's own brother, Tostig, had allied with the fearsome Viking king Harald Hardrada and launched a massive invasion from the north. King Harold was forced to rapidly march his entire army, his housecarls and the feared, the peasant levy, to face this unexpected threat at Stamford Bridge. This is precisely what William's spies had been hoping for, as Harold fought and won a bloody but costly victory against the Vikings in the north. These covert operatives swiftly got a message across the channel. They reported that the Saxon army was now battered, exhausted, and hundreds of miles away from the southern coast. They detailed the state of the defenses along the shore, which were left weakened and undermanned. This was the intelligence coup William needed. He immediately launched his invasion fleet, crossing the channel and landing his forces at Pevensey completely unopposed. He wasn't just lucky, he was perfectly informed. He had the priceless gift of perfect timing granted to him by his unseen agents. William could now choose his ground, rest his troops, and begin ravaging the countryside, forcing a weary Harold to hurry south and fight on terms that heavily favored the Normans. The result, of course, was the Battle of Hastings. The Normans, armed with superior intelligence about the Saxon army's fatigue and tactics, employed feigned retreats to break the Saxon shield wall. King Harold was killed and his army was destroyed. This single day didn't just change a king, it fundamentally transformed England. The Norman conquest brought a new French-speaking ruling class, which eventually blended with Old English to create the Middle English that would evolve into the language we speak today. It overhauled the entire legal and feudal system, building castles like the Tower of London and introducing the Domesday Book, a massive survey of the entire kingdom for tax purposes. The entire cultural and architectural landscape of England was remade, and to think it all hinged on the successful work of a handful of spies. Without that clandestine information about Harold's northern campaign and the weakened southern defenses, William might have landed to find a fresh, full-strength Saxon army waiting for him on the beaches. His invasion could have been repelled right then and there, and the course of British and European history would have veered onto a completely different path. This first instance demonstrates with stunning clarity that the fate of a nation can indeed be decided not just on the battlefield, but in the quiet, treasonous whispers that happen long before the first arrow is ever fired. While William the Conqueror's spies helped seize a kingdom, our next story shows how espionage could be used not just to conquer, but to expertly rule one of the largest and most volatile empires of the Middle Ages. Just over a century after the Norman victory, a figure emerged who would defy every constraint placed upon her gender and station, becoming a legendary political operator whose influence stretched from the Pyrenees to the Scottish border. Eleanor of Aquitaine was not merely a queen, she was a duchess in her own right, a former queen of France, and the matriarch of the sprawling Angevin Empire. In an age where women were often sidelined as political pawns, Eleanor wielded power with a shrewdness that would make modern strategists envious, and her most potent weapon was an intricate and far-reaching intelligence network that kept her informed and in control through decades of war, rebellion, and personal peril. Her need for such a system was born from the sheer complexity of her world. As the ruler of Aquitaine, a vast and wealthy duchy in southwestern France, and later as the wife of King Henry II of England, Eleanor's domains were a tangled web of conflicting loyalties. Her court was a crossroads where languages, cultures, and ambitions clashed. Powerful vassals in Aquitaine chafed under foreign rule. Her own husband was a formidable and often adversarial force, and her sons would eventually turn on their father and each other in a brutal family struggle for power. To navigate this labyrinth of threats, Eleanor could not rely on armies alone. She needed eyes and ears everywhere, a constant, reliable stream of information that would allow her to anticipate plots, forge alliances, and protect her own interests. She turned the traditional roles of women at court into a perfect cover for espionage. Her ladies-in-waiting and courtiers were not just companions, they were her primary agents, skilled at listening to gossip, observing nuances in behavior, and discreetly cultivating sources among knights, clerks, and visiting dignitaries. These trusted individuals formed the nodes of a communication web that stretched across the English Channel. Messengers, often disguised as simple pilgrims or merchants, carried coded letters between her courts at Poitiers, Bordeaux, and London. The content of these messages could be anything from a detailed assessment of a baron's financial troubles, making him ripe for bribery, to overheard whispers about a planned ambush on a royal progress. This flow of intelligence became her lifeline, especially during the 15 years she was imprisoned by her own husband, Henry, after she supported their son's failed rebellion against him. Even from confinement, historical evidence suggests she found ways to send and receive messages, allowing her to continue advising her sons and influencing events from behind stone walls. Her network ensured she was never truly isolated or powerless, a testament to its resilience and her meticulous planning. The ultimate payoff for this decades-long investment in intelligence was the success of her children. Her favorite son, Richard the Lionheart, relied heavily on the political groundwork and information provided by his mother's agents both before and during his reign. When he was captured returning from the Third Crusade, It was Eleanor's network that helped negotiate his ransom and manage his kingdom in his absence. Her meticulous cultivation of alliances and her deep understanding of European politics, all gleaned from her spies, were directly responsible for securing the Angevin crown and expanding its influence. Eleanor of Aquitaine's story powerfully demonstrates that in the medieval world, information was not just a tool for war, but a currency of survival and a means of empowerment. She leveraged it to transcend the limitations imposed on her, proving that a well-placed whisper could be far more effective than a swung sword in shaping the destiny of empires. If Eleanor of Aquitaine's network was a masterclass in long-term political intelligence, our next story plunges us into the brutal, high-stakes world of medieval covert operations where the ultimate goal was not just information but elimination. The sun-baked coast of the Holy Land in the late 12th century was a cauldron of clashing ambitions, where the Third Crusade had devolved into a complex three-way struggle between the legendary Muslim commander Saladin, the fiery king Richard the Lionheart of England, and a cunning, controversial nobleman named Conrad of Montferrat. Conrad, through a combination of shrewd maneuvering and sheer force of personality, had secured for himself the crown of the Kingdom of Jerusalem, a title that made him a pivotal player in the fragile and fraught politics of the region. But his ascent created a dangerous problem for both Richard and Saladin, each for their own reasons, and it was a problem that would ultimately be solved not on the battlefield, but through the stealthy work of assassins guided by precise intelligence. To understand why Conrad had to die, you have to appreciate the precarious balance of power. Richard the Lionheart had spent a fortune and immense political capital to lead the crusade to recapture Jerusalem from Saladin. He saw himself as the unquestioned leader of the Christian effort. Conrad, however, was a rival who challenged Richard's authority at every turn. He argued for different strategies, he commanded the loyalty of a significant faction of knights and barons, and he had even opened his own diplomatic channels with Saladin, negotiating separately from Richard. For the English king, Conrad was an obstinate obstacle to unified command, a man whose personal ambition threatened the entire crusade. From Saladin's perspective, Conrad was equally troublesome. While a divided enemy was generally a good thing, Conrad was a proven and capable defender. He had famously broken Saladin's siege of Tyre years earlier. A strong, legitimate king of Jerusalem like Conrad could potentially unite the fractious Crusader states into a far more formidable and lasting threat. Both of these powerful men, therefore, had a compelling motive to see Conrad removed from the chessboard. This is where the shadowy figures enter the story. Sometime in the spring of 1192, a small group of operatives most historians believe there were two managed to infiltrate Conrad's court in the city of Tyre. They were not soldiers, they were assassins, and their most powerful weapon was the intelligence they had been provided. They knew his routines, his security details, and his movements. On April 28th, they found their moment, as Conrad was returning to his palace after dining with the Bishop of Beauvais. The assassins approached him. According to some accounts, they offered him a letter, a common and non-threatening act that allowed them to get close. As he reached for it, they struck, stabbing him to death in the street. The killers were immediately set upon and killed by Conrad's guards, taking the secret of their ultimate employer to their graves. And that is the great, unresolved mystery that echoes down the centuries. Who sent them? The evidence is frustratingly circumstantial, pointing in two compelling directions. The most obvious suspect is Rashid ad-Din Sinan, the infamous Old Man of the Mountain, leader of the assassin sect. The Ismaili assassins were masters of politically motivated killings and were known to work as mercenaries for hire. A chronicle from the time claims they acted on Saladin's orders, perhaps to eliminate a dangerous enemy. Yet other sources suggest a far more shocking possibility, that Richard the Lionheart himself had secretly hired them. This theory posits that Richard, frustrated by Conrad's defiance, used intermediaries to pay the assassins to do his dirty work, clearing his path to negotiate a truce with Saladin without his rival's interference. The truth may never be known, and it's possible both leaders benefited from the act without directly ordering it. Regardless of who gave the command, the impact was immediate and profound. With Conrad dead, his widow, Isabella, was swiftly married to Richard's own nephew, Henry of Champagne, a man who would be a far more pliable puppet ruler. Richard's influence in the region was suddenly consolidated, free from internal challenge. This intelligence-driven assassination didn't just remove one man, it completely reshaped the political landscape of the Crusader states, allowing Richard to finally secure a treaty with Saladin that guaranteed Christian pilgrims access to Jerusalem before he departed for home. It stands as a stark reminder that in the medieval world, the most effective covert operation was often the simplest and most final one, a blade in the street, guided by a whisper from the shadows, proving that a single, well-planned act of violence could achieve what entire armies sometimes could not. While the assassination of Conrad of Montferrat showed how a single, shadowy act could reshape political alliances, our next story demonstrates the other side of medieval spycraft, the patient, meticulous gathering of tactical intelligence that could bring a seemingly invincible fortress crashing down. Perched high on a sheer limestone cliff overlooking a bend in the Seine River, Château Gaillard was more than just a castle. It was a statement in stone, the ultimate symbol of Angevin power and defiance. Built by Richard the Lionheart himself at staggering expense, it was hailed as his saucy castle, a masterpiece of military engineering that was believed to be utterly impregnable. With its concentric walls, deep ditches, and revolutionary rounded towers designed to deflect siege engines, it stood as the formidable gatekeeper to the Norman heartland, a physical barrier to the ambitions of the French king, Philip II. For Philip, capturing this fortress wasn't just a military objective, it was the key to dismantling the Angevin Empire on the continent once and for all. But how do you conquer the unconquerable? The answer lay not in building a bigger battering ram, but in sending in the right pair of eyes. The siege began in the late summer of 1203, and it quickly settled into a grim stalemate. Philip's forces surrounded the castle, but its formidable defenses and well-supplied garrison, commanded by the experienced Roger de Lacy, repelled every direct assault. Winter arrived, bringing with it the usual hardships of a medieval siege: disease, cold, and dwindling morale for the attackers. A conventional commander might have given up, accepting that the fortress was simply too strong to take. But Philip was not a conventional commander. He understood that brute force was useless without precise knowledge. He needed to find a flaw, a single crack in Richard's brilliant design that his army could exploit. To find it, he turned to a weapon far more subtle than any trebuchet, a team of spies, disguising operatives as simple merchants or perhaps as desperate refugees fleeing the fighting. French intelligence managed to slip them through the English lines and into the castle's outer bailey, the large courtyard that housed the less important residents and support staff during a siege. These anonymous agents, moving through the crowded outer ward with their packs of goods or tales of woe, had one critical mission: observe everything. They noted the routines of the guards, the state of the supplies, and most importantly, the layout of the castle itself. Their most valuable discovery was one that Richard, for all his genius, could never have anticipated. They found that the castle's design, while brilliant, had created an unintended vulnerability. The chapel, located in the outer bailey, was built directly against the inner curtain wall. More importantly, they discovered that a latrine chute from a garderobe in the inner ward emptied out near the base of the chapel's outer wall. This was not a grand secret tunnel, but a small, foul, and undoubtedly overlooked passage, a potential point of entry that was too undignified for the castle's defenders to ever consider fortifying. This crucial piece of intelligence was smuggled back to King Philip. Now he had a plan. In a daring night operation in March of 1204, a small, elite team of French soldiers used the information to their advantage. While the main force created a diversion with an attack on the main gates, these men scaled the cliff beneath the chapel, using the latrine chute or perhaps a fissure in the rock near it. Precisely as the spies had described, they managed to clamber up into the chapel itself, effectively bypassing the castle's mighty outer defenses from the most unexpected direction. Once inside, they fought their way to the inner gates and threw them open, allowing the main French army to pour into the heart of the fortress. The defenders, caught completely by surprise from within their own walls, were overwhelmed. Château Gaillard, the pride of Richard the Lionheart, had fallen. The capture of this single castle sent shockwaves through Normandy and beyond. It was the linchpin of the entire Angevin defensive system. With Gaillard gone, the entire duchy was laid bare to the French advance. Town after town, castle after castle, surrendered to Philip without a fight, recognizing that the tide had irrevocably turned. Within a year, the great Angevin domains in Normandy, built over a century by Henry II and Richard, were absorbed into the French crown lands. This intelligence victory did more than just win a siege. It redrew the map of France, permanently shifting the balance of power from the Plantagenet kings of England to the Capetian monarchy in Paris. It stands as a timeless lesson in warfare, that the most formidable walls are only as strong as their most carefully hidden secret, and that a few observant individuals, armed with nothing more than courage and cunning, can achieve what an entire army cannot. While the fall of Château Gaillard demonstrated the power of tactical intelligence in a single, focused siege, the next story in our saga reveals how espionage could be leveraged on a truly breathtaking continental scale, not to take one castle, but to forge the largest contiguous land empire in human history. The rise of the Mongols under Genghis Khan is often remembered for its thunderous cavalry charges and seemingly unstoppable military might, but this overwhelming force was guided by an unseen hand, one of the most sophisticated and extensive intelligence networks the world had ever seen. The Mongols did not simply conquer through brute strength, they conquered because they knew more than their enemies. They understood that to subdue vast and diverse civilizations from the walled cities of China to the fortified towns of Eastern Europe, they needed a constant, reliable stream of information that could turn unknown lands into familiar territory and powerful kingdoms into vulnerable targets. Their spy system was the central nervous system of their empire, and it was every bit as revolutionary as their famed horseback archers. This network was not an afterthought. It was a core pillar of Genghis Khan's strategic genius, meticulously organized and ruthlessly efficient. Its operatives were not shadowy figures lurking in alleyways, but were more often integrated directly into the military and diplomatic corps. The most forward elements were the Yams, a system of relay stations and scouts that acted as the empire's eyes and ears. These scouts, mounted on the toughest horses, could ride for days, carrying vital intelligence across thousands of miles at a speed that seemed impossible to their adversaries. But the intelligence gatherers went far beyond military scouts. Mongol spies were also diplomats, merchants, and even defectors who had been persuaded or coerced into service. A merchant caravan arriving at a foreign city was not just there to trade goods. Its members were under strict orders to note everything: the height and strength of the walls, the mood of the populace, the rivalries among local nobles, and the preparedness of the garrison. They would count soldiers, sketch fortifications, and listen for any gossip that could be of use. This information was then filtered back to command through the YAM system, creating a living, breathing map of the enemy's strengths and weaknesses. The type of intelligence they sought was remarkably comprehensive, far exceeding simple troop counts. Mongol commanders demanded detailed ethnographic reports. They needed to know about the customs, religions, and internal politics of their targets. Would the population be likely to revolt against their rulers? Were there religious schisms that could be exploited? Which noble families were greedy or disloyal and could be bribed? This deep cultural intelligence allowed the Mongols to practice a form of psychological warfare that was centuries ahead of its time. Before a single arrow was loosed, they would often send envoys to a city, delivering terrifyingly accurate ultimatums that revealed an intimate knowledge of the city's vulnerabilities. They might mention a hidden water source, the name of a corrupt official, or the discontent of a minority group. This demonstration of omniscience was often enough to shatter morale and convince cities to surrender without a fight, saving the Mongols the time and casualties of a prolonged siege. Perhaps the most stunning example of this system in action was the Mongol invasion of Khwarezmia, a powerful empire in Persia and Central Asia. The conflict began after the Khwarezmian Shah executed Mongol diplomats, a catastrophic mistake. In response, Genghis Khan did not just launch a blind, punitive raid. He unleashed his intelligence apparatus. His agents had already provided him with exhaustive details on the Shah's empire, its internal political fractures, the specific rivalries between the Shah's sons and his mother, and the locations of all major cities and armies. When the Mongol armies finally advanced, they moved with shocking speed and precision, bypassing strongpoints and annihilating armies because they knew exactly where to go and who to target. They used this knowledge to split the Shah's forces, isolate his commanders, and systematically dismantle his empire in a matter of months. This pattern repeated itself from China to Russia. The Mongol conquest of the Kievan Rus was similarly facilitated by detailed intelligence on the political disunity of the Russian princes, which the Mongols exploited by defeating them one by one. The legacy of the Mongol spy network is profound. It was the key that unlocked an empire stretching from the Pacific Ocean to the gates of Vienna, fundamentally reshaping trade routes, cultural exchanges, and the geopolitical landscape of Eurasia for centuries. It demonstrated that true power lies not just in the ability to destroy, but in the capacity to understand. The Mongols proved that an army informed by perfect intelligence is an unstoppable force, and that the most effective conquests are those guided by knowledge, making their espionage network one of the most formidable and influential in all of medieval history. After the thunderous conquests of the Mongols demonstrated how intelligence could shatter empires from without, our next story reveals a more subtle but equally devastating art: the use of espionage to destroy a regime from within by turning its own people against it. The stage for this masterclass in covert subversion was the island of Sicily in the late 13th century, a prized jewel in the crown of the Angevin Empire, ruled from Naples by Charles of Anjou. Charles was a man of immense ambition, his gaze fixed on dominating the entire Mediterranean, but his rule over Sicily was harsh, extractive, and deeply resented. He treated the island as little more than a bank to fund his grander designs, imposing heavy taxes and staffing his administration with French officials who looked down upon the local population. The Sicilians, a proud mix of native Italians, Greeks, and Arabs, simmered with a hatred for their foreign overlords, a volatile situation that was just waiting for a spark. That spark would not come from a lone hero. but from a shadowy conspiracy of spies who knew exactly how to weaponize public sentiment. The traditional story of the Sicilian Vespers is a dramatic one. On Easter Monday, March 30th, 1282, at the Church of the Holy Spirit just outside Palermo, a French soldier allegedly harassed a Sicilian woman on her way to evening prayers. This single act of arrogance ignited a firestorm of pent-up rage. The church bells began to ring for Vespers and across the city, and then the entire island, Sicilians rose up using the cry, "Death to the French," as their signal to slaughter thousands of Angevin soldiers and officials in a single, bloody night. While this powerful narrative provides a compelling trigger, modern historians see the hand of covert agents at work, carefully preparing the tinder for that spark long before it was struck. This was not a spontaneous riot. It was a meticulously orchestrated rebellion, and its architects were intelligence operatives working for foreign powers who stood to gain everything from Charles's downfall. Two primary suspects emerge from the shadows. The first is Michael VIII Palaeologus, the Byzantine emperor in Constantinople. Charles of Anjou had openly declared his intention to launch a crusade to reconquer Constantinople and restore the Latin Empire, a move that would have meant the end of Michael's reign and his dynasty. For the Byzantine emperor, stopping Charles was an existential necessity. He had both the motive and the means, maintaining a sophisticated diplomatic and spy network across the Mediterranean. His agents would have been active in Sicily, spreading anti-French propaganda, highlighting stories of Angevin abuses, and whispering to Sicilian nobles about the benefits of throwing off the French yoke. The second, and perhaps more directly involved power, was Peter III of Aragon. Peter was married to Constance, the daughter of the last Hohenstaufen king of Sicily, giving him a direct dynastic claim to the island that Charles had seized. Aragonese spies, likely posing as merchants, sailors, or traveling scholars, would have been instrumental in making contact with disaffected Sicilian barons, promising Aragonese support and coordinating the timing of the uprising to ensure its success and, more importantly, its immediate benefit to Aragon. These agents performed the classic work of subversion. They didn't need to smuggle in weapons or lead troops. Their currency was information and influence. They identified the key grievances: the crushing taxes, the cultural arrogance, the seizure of lands, and amplified them through rumor and propaganda. They sought out the most influential local leaders and assured them of foreign backing, turning private grumbling into a coordinated conspiracy. They helped create the conditions where a single incident, like the one at the church, could catalyze a full-scale revolution instead of just a localized brawl. When the bells finally rang that evening, the network was already in place. The signal was not the start of the planning, but the execution of a plan long in the making. The resulting massacre was horrifyingly effective, wiping out French administrative control on the island in a matter of hours. The geopolitical consequences were immediate and far-reaching. Charles of Anjou's power was broken. His dream of a Mediterranean empire evaporated overnight, and his resources were drained by a 2-decade-long war to try and retake the island, a war he ultimately lost. The Kingdom of Sicily was transferred to the Crown of Aragon, transforming it overnight into a major Mediterranean power with strategic bases astride the key shipping lanes between East and West. This shift in power checked French ambitions in the region for generations and strengthened the Spanish kingdoms that would eventually unite to become a global empire. The Sicilian Vespers stands as a timeless example of what we now call hybrid warfare. It demonstrates that the most decisive victories are sometimes won not on the battlefield, but in the minds of a population, achieved through the patient, invisible work of spies who know that a well-placed rumor can be more destructive than 1,000 knights. Shifting our focus from the sun-drenched Mediterranean to the windswept borderlands between England and Scotland, we find a story where espionage wasn't about empire building or religious conflict, but about the raw, brutal struggle to define a nation itself. The year was 1296, and the ancient town of Berwick-Upon-Tweed stood as a crucial prize. More than just a settlement, Berwick was the largest and wealthiest commercial port in Scotland, a bustling hub of trade with the continent, and perhaps most importantly, it was the key that locked or unlocked the door between the two warring kingdoms. For the ambitious and formidable King Edward I of England, known to history as the Hammer of the Scots, capturing Berwick was the essential first step in his campaign to subjugate Scotland and impose his own chosen ruler. But Edward was a master strategist. He knew that a direct assault on a fortified town could be a bloody, protracted affair. To ensure a swift and decisive victory, he would rely not just on his formidable army, but on a weapon he had used to great effect elsewhere: intelligence provided by the enemy's own people. The political landscape was a tinderbox. The death of the young Scottish Queen, Margaret, the Maid of Norway, had left a vacuum of power, and Edward saw an opportunity to assert his overlordship. When the Scots instead crowned John Balliol as their king, Edward used it as a pretext for invasion. His army marched north, a formidable force of heavy cavalry and skilled longbowmen, but its true direction and initial target were likely sharpened by clandestine information. This is where the shadowy figures enter the narrative. Historical records, including chronicles from the time, strongly suggest that Edward had help from within Scotland itself. Disaffected Scottish nobles, unhappy with Balliol's rule or perhaps bribed with promises of land and titles, are the most likely candidates. These individuals would have possessed intimate knowledge of Berwick's defenses, the strength of its garrison, the condition of its wooden palisade walls, the daily routines of its guards, and perhaps even the mood of its citizens. They provided Edward with a critical intelligence coup, a detailed assessment of the town's vulnerabilities. This was not a fortress like Château Gaillard. Its primary defense was its location, surrounded on three sides by water from the River Tweed and the North Sea. Its landward walls were its weak point. The intelligence likely confirmed that the garrison was overconfident and undermanned, believing the marshy terrain and the town's reputation would deter a full-scale assault. More importantly, the spies might have revealed the precise state of the defense's sections of the wall that were in disrepair, or a gate that was less fortified than others. Armed with this precise knowledge, Edward could plan his attack with devastating efficiency. He didn't need to besiege the town and wait for starvation to do its work. He could launch a direct, overwhelming assault exactly where it would hurt the most. On March 30th, 1296, Edward's forces arrived outside Berwick. What happened next was a calculated act of shocking violence, guided by prior intelligence. The English army did not hesitate or parley for long. They stormed the town, focusing their attack on the weakest points that had been identified for them. Chronicles describe a horrific massacre. The Scottish garrison, taken by surprise by the ferocity and precision of the assault, was quickly overwhelmed. The townspeople, including many civilians, were cut down in the streets. The number of dead is disputed by sources, ranging from several thousand to wildly inflated figures, but the psychological impact was undeniable and immediate. Berwick fell in a single day, its capture serving as a terrifying demonstration of Edward's ruthlessness and his seemingly supernatural ability to breach defenses. The fall of Berwick was far more than a military conquest. It was a profound symbolic and strategic catastrophe for Scotland. The loss of its primary trading port was a massive economic blow, severing a vital artery of commerce and wealth. But more than that, it became an instant and powerful symbol of English domination, a constant, grim reminder of what happened to those who defied the hammer of the Scots. The event effectively marked the beginning of the long and brutal wars of Scottish independence, galvanizing Scottish resistance under figures like William Wallace and Robert the Bruce, who would use the memory of Berwick's sack as a rallying cry for national liberation. This instance powerfully illustrates that espionage in border conflicts is about more than just tactics. It's about controlling the narrative of power. The intelligence that enabled Berwick's capture didn't just give England a town, it gave them a psychological weapon, proving that the right information, delivered at the right time, could not only capture a key strategic point, but could also help ignite a war that would define a national identity for centuries to come. The capture of Berwick was a devastating blow, but for the Scots, it was not the end. It was a call to arms, a brutal lesson that would soon birth a legend. In the years that followed, a new figure emerged from the chaos, a man whose name would become synonymous with defiance, William Wallace. A knight of modest means but immense passion, Wallace galvanized the Scottish resistance with a stunning victory at the Battle of Stirling Bridge, proving that the seemingly invincible English war machine could be broken. For a glorious, fleeting moment, he became the guardian of Scotland, a symbol of hope and a living nightmare for Edward I. But symbols make for the most tempting targets, and Edward, the master of political warfare, knew that to break a rebellion, you must first decapitate its leadership. He would not defeat Wallace on another open battlefield. Instead, he would orchestrate his downfall from within, using the oldest and most corrosive weapon in the espionage arsenal, betrayal. The hunt for Wallace was Edward's paramount objective, a personal vendetta that consumed the English king. After the defeat at Falkirk, Wallace had resigned his guardianship and transitioned into a different, more elusive role, a guerrilla leader, a master of irregular warfare who moved like a ghost through the Scottish lowlands and highlands, rallying support and planning raids. To catch such a man required more than just cavalry patrols. It demanded a web of informants. Edward, understanding the power of money and fear, likely employed both with ruthless efficiency. His agents would have moved through the Scottish gentry, identifying those with grievances, those in debt, or those simply terrified of the English king's wrath. The promise of a royal pardon, a hefty bag of silver, or the threat of seeing their estates burned could turn even a loyal Scot into a potential asset. The most infamous of these figures was Sir John de Menteith, the Scottish nobleman appointed as the keeper of Dumbarton Castle, but he was almost certainly not acting alone. He was merely the final hand that pulled the net tight. The net itself was woven by many others, a network of whispers and treachery that slowly closed around the freedom fighter. The intelligence that led to Wallace's capture was likely a mosaic of small reports pieced together over time. A spy in a tavern might overhear a drunken boast about supplying the rebel band. A bribed servant in a loyalist household could report on suspicious visitors. Someone, somewhere, provided the crucial detail that Wallace was expected at a farmhouse near Glasgow in August of 1305. This was not a grand military secret stolen from a war council. It was human intelligence gathered in shadows that revealed a pattern of movement and a moment of vulnerability. On the 5th of August, acting on this precise information, Menteith and a company of English soldiers descended on the location. The capture was swift and without a significant fight. Wallace, the man who had defied an empire, was taken not in a glorious last stand, but in a quiet ambush, betrayed by those he might have once called countrymen. The aftermath was a masterclass in psychological warfare designed to shatter the Scottish spirit. Wallace was immediately transported to London, a long and humiliating journey to demonstrate his complete subjugation. His show trial at Westminster Hall was a foregone conclusion, a spectacle of English justice where he was condemned as a traitor, a chilling irony for a man who had never sworn fealty to the English crown. The subsequent execution was meticulously brutal, a public dismemberment designed to serve as the ultimate warning. Every stage of this process, from the covert intelligence gathering to the very public brutality, was calculated to send an unambiguous message: resistance is futile, and its leaders will meet the most gruesome end. In the short term, the strategy worked brilliantly. With Wallace dead and his allies scattered or subdued, the organized Scottish resistance collapsed. Edward had successfully neutralized the heart of the rebellion, and English authority over Scotland appeared absolute. But this story holds a deeper, more paradoxical lesson about the limits of espionage and the unpredictable nature of symbolism. While Edward's spies succeeded in eliminating the man, they inadvertently immortalized the myth. The betrayal and brutal martyrdom of William Wallace did not permanently extinguish the dream of Scottish independence. Instead, it poured fuel on the embers of resentment. His death created a vacant space for a new, more politically astute leader to emerge, Robert the Bruce. Bruce would learn from Wallace's fate, understanding that charisma alone was not enough. Survival required cunning, diplomacy, and a ruthless awareness of the potential for betrayal within his own ranks. The very act meant to crush a rebellion ultimately provided its next leader with a powerful rallying cry and a cautionary tale. Edward's intelligence victory was complete, but his political victory was temporary. He had won the battle against a man, but in doing so, he had unwittingly strengthened the very idea he sought to destroy, proving that while spies can capture a hero, they cannot always kill a cause. While kings and emperors used spies to expand their earthly domains, the most powerful spiritual institution of the Middle Ages discovered that celestial authority, too, required a firm grounding in terrestrial intelligence. Our journey now takes us to the 14th century and the sun-baked banks of the Rhône River in France, to the walled city of Avignon. For nearly 70 years, this was the seat of the Papacy, a period known as the Avignon Papacy, or the Babylonian Captivity, where a succession of French popes ruled the universal church far from its traditional home in Rome. Isolated from the Italian states and surrounded by the growing power of the French monarchy, these popes faced a precarious existence. Their claim to spiritual supremacy was being challenged by increasingly confident secular rulers, rising nationalist sentiments, and dangerous new heresies that questioned the very foundation of church doctrine. To navigate this complex and threatening landscape, the Avignon popes did something extraordinary. They built one of the most extensive and sophisticated intelligence networks medieval Europe had ever seen, proving that the keys to heaven sometimes had to be forged with the tools of earthly espionage. This papal spy ring was not a minor operation. It was a vital organ of the Church's administrative body, funded directly from the papal treasury and answering to the highest levels of the Curia. Its operatives were as diverse as the threats they were tasked with monitoring. At the most visible level were the papal legates and nuncios, diplomats dispatched to royal courts across Christendom. While their official role was to represent the Pope's interests, their unofficial duty was to observe and report. They noted the health and moods of kings, listened for whispers of rebellion among the nobility, and gauged the loyalty of local bishops. But beneath these high-level agents was a much broader and more shadowy network. Mendicant friars, particularly Dominicans and Franciscans, were ideal intelligence gatherers. Their vows of poverty allowed them to move without suspicion among the poor and the powerful alike, and their constant travel between monasteries provided perfect cover for carrying messages. University scholars in centers like Paris, Oxford, and Bologna were another key source. reporting on new and potentially dangerous intellectual currents brewing in the lecture halls. Even merchants with their far-flung trade routes could be persuaded or paid to carry a sealed letter or pass on a juicy piece of court gossip that had financial implications. The scope of intelligence they gathered was breathtakingly comprehensive, reflecting the papacy's global concerns. A typical report landing on the Pope's desk in Avignon might contain a detailed analysis of the English Parliament's latest tax levy, a warning about the spread of Waldensian heretics in the Alpine valleys, a decoded letter between two Italian condottieri discussing a potential mercenary contract, and a whispered rumor about the Holy Roman Emperor's deteriorating health. This information was power. It allowed the Pope to play the role of Europe's ultimate power broker. If a king was planning a war against a neighbor, the Pope could use foreknowledge of those plans to offer mediation for a price, such as greater influence over episcopal appointments in that kingdom. If a popular preacher was beginning to attract a suspiciously large following, the spy network could provide early warnings, allowing the Inquisition to move in and investigate before the movement could spread. The popes used this intelligence to issue strategic excommunications, grant benefices to loyal nobles, and form alliances that kept the fragile balance of power tilted in their favor. Perhaps the most significant and lasting impact of this vast intelligence apparatus was its role in the great theological and political debates of the era. When the English Franciscan philosopher William of Ockham began writing tracts that challenged papal absolutism, arguing for a separation of spiritual and secular power, the Avignon popes were among the first to know the details of his arguments, thanks to their agents at the University of Oxford. This early warning allowed them to prepare counter-arguments, condemn his works, and pressure his protectors. Similarly, during the rise of the conciliar movement, which argued that a council of bishops held more authority than the Pope himself, the papal spies were instrumental in identifying the key thinkers and political leaders behind the idea, enabling the papacy to divide its opponents and ultimately reassert its primacy after the schism ended. The Avignon papacy spy ring demonstrates that in an age of rising secularism, the Church understood that protecting its spiritual mission required a very worldly command of information, proving that even the most devout institutions must sometimes operate in the shadows to stay in the light. Yet, even as kings and popes used spies to manage the affairs of state and church, the greatest threat to the established order sometimes came not from rival nobles or foreign powers, but from the simmering discontent of the common people themselves. In the spring of 1381, England was a pressure cooker ready to explode. A perfect storm of grievances had been brewing for decades. The Black Death had decimated the population, leading to labor shortages that should have empowered workers, but instead, the ruling class responded with the repressive statute of laborers, freezing wages and tying peasants to the land. On top of this economic stranglehold, the government imposed a series of hated poll taxes to fund the ongoing and unsuccessful 100 Years' War against France. The third such tax, collected in early 1381, was the final straw. It was not just the cost, but the brutal, inequitable way it was enforced that ignited a firestorm of rage across southeastern England. What began as local protests quickly coalesced into a massive, organized rebellion. The Peasants' Revolt marching on London with a leader named Wat Tyler at its head and a demand for an end to serfdom. For the young king Richard II, only 14 years old, this was the ultimate crisis, a direct challenge to the very foundation of feudal society. And his most powerful weapon in defeating it would not be his army but his spies. The royal response was a masterclass in counterinsurgency, and it began with intelligence gathering. Richard and his advisors, including his powerful uncle John of Gaunt, understood that to crush a popular uprising, they needed to understand it from the inside. They could not simply send knights to charge into an angry mob. They needed to know the rebels' plans, their numbers, their leaders, and their weaknesses. To do this, they deployed a network of informants and agents provocateurs directly into the heart of the rebellion. These operatives were likely drawn from a pool of lesser gentry, royal clerks, or even merchants who moved freely between the classes and whose loyalties could be secured through payment or fear. Disguised as sympathetic laborers or itinerant preachers echoing the rebels' rhetoric of equality, these spies infiltrated the large camps that were springing up outside London. Their mission was to listen, to identify the key captains and orators, and most crucially, to discover what the rebels truly wanted and how they planned to achieve it. The intelligence they sent back to the king was likely a stream of critical details: the planned routes of the various rebel bands converging on the capital, the specific grievances of different counties, the identities of radical leaders like the preacher John Ball, and the alarming fact that the rebels enjoyed some sympathy within London's own population. This information was priceless. It allowed the young king to shift from a position of blind panic to one of calculated strategy. He knew he could not militarily defeat the tens of thousands of rebels already storming the city's gates and burning the palaces of his hated advisors, like John of Gaunt's Savoy Palace. Instead, he used the intelligence to set a trap, choosing negotiation not as a sincere path to reform, but as a deliberate tactic to divide, deceive, and disarm the rebellion. The most famous example of this strategy in action was the meeting at Mile End on June 14th. Based on his spies' reports, Richard knew the rebels' demands. He rode out to meet them, a brave and calculated act, and to the astonishment of all, he agreed to everything. He promised charters of manumission to end serfdom and to address their other grievances. This act of apparent royal benevolence was in reality a brilliant intelligence-driven maneuver. It immediately split the rebel force. Satisfied with the king's word, a large portion of the rebels, particularly those from the more moderate counties, simply took their charters and went home. They believed they had won. This left only the most hardened and radical core of the rebellion, now led by Wat Tyler, isolated and much more vulnerable. The final act played out the next day at Smithfield. Another meeting was arranged, and again, the king's spies had likely prepared him for Tyler's more aggressive and confrontational demeanor. When Tyler was provoked and then killed by the Lord Mayor of London in a chaotic scuffle, the rebel army was left leaderless and stunned. It was at this precise moment of maximum confusion that King Richard, displaying a courage far beyond his years and acting on the confidence granted by his intelligence, rode forward alone and shouted to the angry mob, "I am your captain, follow me." This breathtaking act of theatrical leadership, made possible because he knew the rebels were now off balance and decapitated, effectively ended the revolt on the spot. The crowd, bewildered and without direction, dispersed. In the days that followed, the king's promises were swiftly revoked. The charters were declared null and void, extracted under duress. Royal judges followed the retreating rebels back to their villages, conducting a brutal wave of arrests and executions that ruthlessly reimposed the old order. The Peasants' Revolt was over. The outcome was a stark lesson in the use of espionage for social control. The spies of Richard II did not engage in dramatic acts of sabotage or assassination. Their work was subtler and far more effective. By providing a constant stream of human intelligence, they turned an opaque and terrifying mass movement into a known quantity. They identified its pressure points and its fractures. This knowledge allowed the crown to substitute cunning for brute force, to dismantle the rebellion from within through promises it never intended to keep, and to ultimately reinforce the very feudal hierarchies the peasants had risen to destroy. It demonstrated that in the face of popular uprising, the most powerful weapon a king could wield was not a sword but a secret, a whispered report that allowed him to see his enemy clearly and strike not at its body but at its heart. If the Peasants' Revolt showed how espionage could be used to crush a domestic threat, the events on a bridge outside Paris in 1419 demonstrate how the same shadowy tools could be turned inward, tearing a nation apart at the seams and inviting a foreign predator to feast on the carcass. France in the early 15th century was a kingdom divided against itself, a bloody civil war between two powerful noble factions, the Armagnacs and the Burgundians, raging atop the longer conflict with England known as the 100 Years' War. At the heart of this internal strife was John the Fearless, the ambitious and calculating Duke of Burgundy. His lands were vast and wealthy, nearly a state within a state, and his personal ambition was to dominate the weak French monarchy, personified by the increasingly mad King Charles VI. John had already proven his ruthlessness years earlier by ordering the assassination of his rival, the Duke of Orleans, an act that had ignited the Civil War. Now, with the English King Henry V rampaging through Normandy after his stunning victory at Agincourt, the pressure to unite against the common enemy was immense. But old hatreds run deep, and on a bridge at Montferrat, diplomacy would be murdered by the very thing it sought to overcome, a legacy of betrayal that spies had helped cultivate. The stage was set for a precarious peace conference. In September of 1419, John the Fearless agreed to meet with the Dauphin, the future Charles VII, who was the figurehead of the Armagnac faction. The chosen location was a bridge, a neutral ground where both parties could meet without fear of an ambush. The intention was noble, to forge an alliance, to combine their forces, and to finally turn their attention to expelling the English invaders. But in the fractured world of French politics, noble intentions were often just a mask for darker designs. The Armagnacs had every reason to distrust and despise John. He was the man who had killed one of their leaders, who had previously allied with the English himself, and whose power constantly threatened their own influence over the Mad King and the Dauphin. For them, a genuine peace with Burgundy might mean sharing power, or worse, being subsumed by it. The idea that John the Fearless could not be trusted, that he might be plotting a double cross even at this moment of supposed reconciliation, would have been a constant topic of discussion in Armagnac councils. This atmosphere of intense paranoia was the perfect breeding ground for covert action. This is where the shadow of espionage falls over the event. While the historical record cannot provide a smoking gun with the names of specific agents, the circumstances point overwhelmingly to the work of intelligence operatives aligned with the most hardline elements of the Armagnac faction. Their mission would not have been to facilitate peace, but to ensure it never happened. These agents would have been tasked with reinforcing the Dauphin's fears about John's sincerity, perhaps even fabricating reports of a planned Burgundian betrayal at the meeting itself. They might have spread rumors among the Armagnac knights that John's men were secretly armed for a fight, thus putting the Dauphin's own guard on a hair trigger. The most crucial role of these spies would have been logistical, providing precise intelligence on the layout of the bridge, the number of men John would bring, and the exact protocol for the meeting. This information would have allowed the Armagnac commanders to plan their own move, not for peace, but for a final, bloody resolution to their rivalry. On the 10th of September, the two parties met on the bridge at Montferrat. The protocols of chivalry and diplomacy were meticulously observed at first. John the Fearless, demonstrating his trust, doffed his helmet and bowed before the Dauphin. But as he rose, the tension exploded. an argument broke out, its exact subject lost to time, perhaps a deliberate provocation by an Armagnac knight acting on orders. In the heat of the moment, the Dauphin's guards, their nerves frayed by fear and likely prepped by whispers of treachery, surged forward. They set upon the Duke of Burgundy, hacking him to death right there on the bridge in front of his horrified retinue. It was not a battle, it was a brutal, close-quarters murder dressed in the finery of a diplomatic summit. The immediate aftermath was catastrophic for France. John's son and heir, Philip the Good, was consumed with a burning desire for vengeance. Blaming the Armagnacs and the Dauphin for his father's murder, he did the unthinkable. He formally allied with the English, signing the Treaty of Troyes in 1420. This treaty disinherited the Dauphin, Charles, and declared the English king, Henry V, the legitimate heir to the French throne. This single act, born from the assassination at Montferrat, gave the English a legal and political legitimacy in France they had never before possessed. It prolonged the 100 Years' War for another generation, cementing English control over vast swaths of French territory and pushing the kingdom to the very brink of extinction. The assassination of John the Fearless, very likely facilitated by shadowy intelligence agents, did not just kill a man, it killed the last best hope for a united French resistance, delivering the nation into the hands of its enemies and proving that in the Game of Thrones, the most dangerous weapon is often a well-placed lie that turns diplomacy into a death warrant. Yet even the most brutal political assassination could not extinguish the flame of French resistance, for a new and utterly unexpected kind of leader was about to emerge, one whose power came not from noble blood or military experience, but from a divine mission that would temporarily blindside both the English and their Burgundian allies. By 1429, the 100 Years' War had reached its lowest ebb for France. The Treaty of Troyes had disinherited the Dauphin. English forces occupied much of the north, including the key city of Paris, and morale was shattered. Then, a 17-year-old peasant girl from Domremy, claiming to be guided by the voices of saints, arrived at the Dauphin's court. Joan of Arc was a phenomenon that the conventional intelligence networks of the time were completely unprepared for. She was a living symbol, a figure who single-handedly reversed the psychological momentum of the war. Her stunning victory at the Siege of Orleans broke the English stranglehold, and her subsequent campaign led to the Dauphin's coronation as King Charles VII at Rheims, a sacred act that legitimized his rule in the eyes of God and country. For the English, Joan was not just a military problem, she was a propaganda disaster. Their entire claim to the French throne was based on legalistic documents like the Treaty of Troyes, but Joan's success was seen by many as a clear sign of divine favor for the French cause. She had to be stopped, and not just defeated, she had to be discredited, captured, and eliminated in a way that would prove her a fraud and break the spirit of the French resistance once and for all. This was a task for which espionage was perfectly suited. The campaign to neutralize Joan required a shift in strategy. After their shocking defeats at her hands, the English and their Burgundian allies realized that facing her on the battlefield where her symbolic power was greatest was a losing proposition. Instead, they began to rely on a more patient, insidious method. Intelligence gathering aimed at predicting her movements and creating a trap. Joan's greatest weakness was her own aggressive, front-line leadership style. She was always at the vanguard, leading charges and inspiring troops. This made her predictable in her courage and vulnerable to an enemy who knew where she would be. In the spring of 1430, Joan was involved in defending the town of Compiègne, which was under attack by Burgundian forces. The town was a strategic point on the Oise River, and its defense was typical of the messy, shifting front lines of the war. What was not typical was the level of intelligence the Burgundians seemed to possess. Historical accounts strongly suggest that spies either within the French command structure, the town itself, or positioned as observers in the countryside were providing detailed reports on French sorties and Joan's personal involvement in them. On the 23rd of May, Joan led a sortie from Campigny's gates to attack a Burgundian camp. Initially successful, the attack soon turned into a disaster. The Burgundian forces, seemingly prepared for the counterattack, rallied quickly and were reinforced. As the French troops fell back toward the town gates, the Burgundians focused their efforts with unusual precision on isolating Joan. Most tellingly, the captain of Campigny, Guillaume de Flavy, gave the order to raise the town's drawbridge, effectively cutting off her retreat while many of her soldiers were still outside. Whether this was a panicked decision or a calculated betrayal based on prior arrangement with the Burgundians remains one of history's enduring mysteries, but it points to the successful penetration of the French defense by enemy intelligence. Isolated on the riverbank, Joan was pulled from her horse by a Burgundian archer and taken prisoner. This was not a random act of battlefield chance. It had the hallmarks of a meticulously planned operation, with the goal of capturing a specific high-value target whose capture was worth more than 1,000 foot soldiers. The immediate intelligence coup was a triumph for the Burgundians, but the subsequent exploitation of that prize was a masterstroke of psychological warfare orchestrated by the English. Joan was initially held by her Burgundian captor, John of Luxembourg, while the English negotiated feverishly for her purchase. They didn't just want her imprisoned, they needed to control her narrative. Their entire strategy revolved around putting her on trial not as a prisoner of war, but as a heretic. By convicting her of witchcraft and heresy, they could achieve two vital objectives. First, they could invalidate the Dauphin's coronation at Reims by proving he had been crowned with the aid of a devil worshipper. And second, they could demolish her symbolic power, turning her from a divine savior into a condemned criminal. The trial at Rouen was the final, brutal act of this intelligence operation. Every aspect of it was designed to break her spirit and prove the English narrative. The outcome was a foregone conclusion. Joan was convicted and burned at the stake on the 30th of May, 1431. The impact of her capture and execution was profound and twofold. In the immediate sense, it was a devastating blow to French morale. The seemingly heaven-sent maid who had turned the tide was gone, seemingly abandoned by both her king and her god. Charles VII, perhaps fearing the taint of her condemnation or simply seeing her as a political liability now that her military usefulness had ended, made no serious effort to ransom or rescue her. Yet, in the long term, the English overplayed their hand. The sheer injustice of the trial, the cruelty of her execution, and the political nature of the charges began to sow doubt. Instead of erasing her memory, her martyrdom cemented her legend. Within a generation, the Church would initiate a process of rehabilitation, and Joan would be transformed from a condemned heretic into a national saint and the eternal symbol of French resilience. The English intelligence operation had succeeded in the short-term tactical goal of removing a formidable inspirational leader, but it ultimately failed in its long-term strategic goal of discrediting the French cause, proving that while spies can capture and even kill a symbol, they cannot always control what that symbol comes to mean. For over 1,000 years, the massive walls of Constantinople had stood as an immovable symbol of imperial power, repelling over 20 sieges and preserving the flame of the Roman Empire long after Rome itself had fallen. By the spring of 1453, however, that flame was flickering. The once mighty Byzantine Empire had been reduced to little more than the city itself and a handful of distant outposts, a pale shadow of its former glory. Yet its legendary defenses, the famous triple line of the Theodosian walls, were still considered the most formidable in the known world. To any conventional military mind, breaching them was an almost impossible task. But the new Ottoman Sultan, the 21-year-old Mehmed II, was not a conventional thinker. He was a visionary who understood that to conquer the unconquerable, he would need more than just cannons and soldiers. He would need to see through stone to know the enemy's heart and mind. His most crucial weapons in the coming siege would not be forged in iron, but gathered in the shadows by a legion of unseen eyes. Mehmed's intelligence campaign began months, perhaps even years, before his army ever marched. He was a student of history and warfare, and he knew that every fortress, no matter how strong, has two potential points of failure: a physical weakness in its structure and a psychological weakness in its defenders. His network of agents was tasked with finding both. These operatives were a diverse group: Muslim merchants who had traded within the city for generations, Christian mercenaries willing to sell information for gold, and perhaps even disaffected Greeks within the Byzantine administration itself who saw the rising Ottoman star and decided to align with the winning side. Their mission was to create a complete picture of the city's vulnerabilities. They didn't just count the towers, they studied the composition of the mortar between the stones. They didn't just note the number of soldiers, they gauged their morale, their pay, and their loyalty to the Byzantine Emperor, Constantine XI. The intelligence they provided was breathtaking in its detail and scope. Spies provided sketches of the land walls, highlighting sections that had been repaired hastily or weakened by previous earthquakes. They reported on the critical state of the city's moat, which in many places had silted up, making it less of an obstacle. They even discovered a small, forgotten sally port, the Kirkaport, a gate which was inadequately defended. But perhaps the most valuable intelligence was not about stone and mortar, but about the people behind them. Mehmed's agents delivered reports of the deep and bitter divisions plaguing the defense. They detailed the fierce rivalry between the Byzantine military commander, Giovanni Giustiniani Longo, a Genos mercenary, and the Venetian contingents also helping to defend the city. They reported on the despair of the population, who saw their emperor begging for aid from a fractured Latin West that sent far too little, far too late. Most importantly, they confirmed that the city's legendary chain, which could block the Golden Horn Inlet, was its primary naval defense. This last piece of information would lead to one of Mehmed's most audacious plans: to bypass the chain entirely by hauling his ships overland on greased logs, a move that would completely outflank the Byzantine defenders and strike terror into their hearts. Armed with this comprehensive intelligence, Mehmed could plan his assault with surgical precision. His massive cannon, the infamous Basilica, was not placed at random. It was positioned to bombard a specific section of the walls that reconnaissance had identified as a weak point. His repeated attacks were not merely tests of strength. They were probes designed to identify which parts of the defense were held by the most determined troops and which were manned by the less reliable militia. He knew where to apply pressure and when to feint, stretching the already thin Byzantine forces to their breaking point. The final assault on the 29th of May was the culmination of this intelligence-driven strategy. After weeks of constant bombardment and attrition, Mehmed launched a multi-wave attack, using his irregular troops to exhaust the defenders before sending in his elite janissaries for the final blow. It was during this chaotic, pre-dawn climax that the intelligence on the Kirkaport gate may have played a role, with some sources suggesting Ottoman troops found it open or poorly defended, creating a fatal breach in the inner sanctum. The fall of Constantinople was more than a military victory. It was a seismic event that shattered the medieval world and forged a new one. The end of the Byzantine Empire marked the final closure of the Roman chapter in history and established the Ottoman Empire as the preeminent power in the Eastern Mediterranean. The conquest shifted the balance of trade and power permanently eastward, forcing European kingdoms to seek new sea routes to Asia, thus inadvertently sparking the age of exploration. Mehmed II earned his title, the Conqueror, not just through the force of his cannons, but through the power of his knowledge. The siege stands as the ultimate testament to a fundamental truth of warfare, that the most brilliant strategy is built upon a foundation of information. The walls of Constantinople were defeated not because they were weak, but because Mehmed's spies made them transparent, proving that no defense, however ancient or mighty, can ever be strong enough to withstand an enemy who already knows all of its secrets. While the fall of Constantinople demonstrated how espionage could topple an empire from the outside, a different kind of intelligence war was being waged within England, a vicious family feud fought in shadowed corridors and coded letters that would decide the fate of a throne. The Wars of the Roses, the infamous 15th century struggle between the rival houses of Lancaster and York, is often pictured as a series of dramatic battles filled with chivalric knights and shifting allegiances. But beneath the surface of these grand clashes lay a far more subtle and decisive battlefield, a silent war of information where spies and informants became the true architects of victory and defeat. This wasn't a conflict won solely by the strength of a cavalry charge, but by the power of a stolen letter, a bribed guard, or a whispered conversation overheard in a crowded tavern. In a civil war where brother turned against cousin and loyalty was a currency constantly devalued, the only thing more valuable than a sharp sword was a reliable secret. The very nature of the conflict made it a perfect environment for espionage to thrive. This was a dynastic struggle, meaning the factions were not foreign enemies but intertwined branches of the same royal family and their noble supporters. The Yorkist and Lancastrian courts were not separate entities. They were filled with people who knew each other intimately, former allies, childhood friends, and in-laws. This closeness created a terrifying atmosphere of paranoia, but also provided unparalleled opportunities for infiltration. A knight switching sides brought with him not just his martial skill, but invaluable knowledge of his former lord's battle plans, personality, and hidden weaknesses. A lady-in-waiting could carry messages between camps under the guise of visiting family. A disgruntled servant, paid with a bag of silver, could leave a postern gate unlocked or report on his master's private conversations. The intelligence sought was intensely personal and immediate. Was the Duke of Clarence truly loyal to his brother Edward IV, or was he plotting with the Lancastrians? Was the Earl of Warwick, the kingmaker, preparing to switch sides once again? Which northern lord could be bribed to bring his retainers to the next battle? The answers to these questions were more valuable than entire companies of archers. This shadow war reached its brutal climax at the Battle of Bosworth Field in 1485, the final and most decisive engagement of the wars. The stage was set between the usurping Yorkist king, Richard III, and his challenger, Henry Tudor, the last Lancastrian hope. On paper, Richard held the advantage. He was an experienced commander with a larger army and held the central position. But Henry Tudor had a powerful, unseen ally, a web of espionage and betrayal that had been woven around Richard for months. Key to this was the Stanley family, powerful lords who commanded a significant portion of Richard's own forces. The Stanleys had been playing a double game, secretly communicating with Henry while maintaining a facade of loyalty to Richard. The intelligence they provided to Henry was likely comprehensive, detailed layouts of Richard's camp, the mood and loyalty of his other commanders, and the king's own battle plan. Most critically, they assured Henry that when the moment came, they would not fight for the king. On the day of the battle, this intelligence proved devastating. Richard, aware of the Stanleys' ambiguous position but perhaps underestimating the depth of their treachery, kept their forces at arm's length, holding the Stanley brothers' sons as hostages to ensure their good behavior. This act itself may have been based on faulty intelligence, a misreading of how far the Stanleys were willing to go. As the battle raged, Richard saw an opportunity for a quick end, a direct, desperate cavalry charge aimed directly at Henry Tudor himself, who was visible under his banner. This was a gamble that might have worked, but it was a gamble made without crucial information. What Richard did not know, but Henry almost certainly did thanks to his spies, was that the Stanleys were poised and waiting for this exact moment. As Richard thundered across the field, closing in on Henry, Sir William Stanley finally made his move. He turned his forces not against Henry, but against Richard, slamming into the flank of the king's elite guard. The attack was perfectly timed and perfectly placed, a maneuver born of foreknowledge. Isolated and overwhelmed, Richard III was cut down within sight of his goal. His crown was famously plucked from a thorn bush and placed on Henry Tudor's head, marking the end of the Plantagenet dynasty and the birth of the Tudor age. The outcome of Bosworth, and by extension the entire Wars of the Roses, was not just a military victory, it was an intelligence triumph. The Tudor dynasty, which would rule England for over a century and shape its national identity, was founded not on a clear right of succession, but on a battlefield where hidden loyalties and well-timed betrayals decided the outcome. The wars illustrated with brutal clarity that in a dynastic struggle where the line between friend and foe is constantly blurred, information becomes the ultimate currency and the deadliest weapon. It demonstrated that a king could command the largest army and hold the highest ground, but without a clear picture of the hearts and minds of those around him, he was fighting blind, a lesson the new King Henry VII learned well, as he would go on to create a sophisticated intelligence apparatus of his own to protect his hard-won throne. If the Wars of the Roses demonstrated how espionage could decide a dynastic conflict, the story of the Borgia family reveals how these shadowy arts could be perfected into a terrifyingly personal instrument of power, elevating a single clan from outsiders to the very pinnacle of Renaissance intrigue. In the fragmented, beautiful, and lethally competitive landscape of late 15th century Italy, where city-states and principalities waged constant, silent war against each other, a new kind of political operator emerged. The Borgias, originally from Spain, were viewed with suspicion by the Italian Old Guard, but under the ruthless guidance of Pope Alexander VI, Rodrigo Borgia, and his son, Cesare, they would weaponize information with a brutality and efficiency that became the stuff of legend. Theirs was not espionage in service of a nation or a grand ideal. It was intelligence gathering refined into a surgical tool for the sole purpose of advancing one family's name, wealth, and dominion, proving that in the cutthroat world of Renaissance politics, a well-placed spy was more valuable than a regiment of mercenaries. The engine of this family ambition was a sophisticated and far-reaching intelligence network, personally overseen by Cesare Borgia. As a cardinal and later as the Duke of Valentinois, Cesare understood that his father's papal authority provided a shield, but true power came from knowing everyone else's secrets. His agents were everywhere, drawn from every level of society. They included courtiers in the palaces of rival families like the Orsini and Colonna, who reported on dinner-table conversations and private grievances. They included bankers who handled the accounts of his enemies and could reveal their financial vulnerabilities. Perhaps most effectively, they included the staffery, the ubiquitous messengers who crisscrossed the Italian peninsula. Cessair famously maintained a corps of these couriers, men mounted on the fastest horses, who could not only carry his orders with incredible speed but also function as his eyes and ears, observing troop movements and listening to gossip in every tavern along their route. This system gave the Borgias a decisive advantage. They often knew their rivals' plans before those rivals had even finalized them. The application of this intelligence was as swift as it was merciless. The Borgias did not simply gather information for defensive purposes. They used it to launch precise, preemptive strikes. When a noble family became too powerful or threatened their plans for a centralized Borgia state in the Romagna region, Cessair did not necessarily march to war. First, he would consult his network. His spies would work to identify the key pressure points: a condottiero captain who could be bribed to switch sides, a jealous younger brother who coveted the family title, or a secret love affair that could be used for blackmail. The infamous Banquet of Chestnuts, a scandalous gathering at the Vatican, was likely not just an exercise in decadence but a sophisticated intelligence operation designed to compromise powerful guests and gather blackmail material under the guise of entertainment. When the time was right, the strike would come not with a declaration of war, but with a surprise arrest, a forced confession, or the most feared tool in their arsenal, assassination. The mysterious deaths of numerous Borgia rivals, often attributed to the legendary Cantarella poison, were almost certainly preceded by careful espionage to learn the target's daily routines, dietary habits, and the identity of a trusted servant who could be persuaded or coerced into administering the dose. The true masterpiece of Borgia espionage, however, was its role in Cessair's military campaigns. His rapid conquest of the Romagna was a marvel of political and military strategy, and it was entirely dependent on superior intelligence. Before his armies ever marched, his agents had already infiltrated his target cities. They provided detailed maps, reported on garrison strength and morale, and most importantly, identified which influential citizens were dissatisfied with their current rulers and could be turned into collaborators. This allowed Cessair to often achieve his goals without a costly siege. He would arrive at a city's gates, and his agents inside would already have spread propaganda against the current lord and prepared the ground for a peaceful surrender. He didn't just conquer territory, he subverted it from within, using information to turn an enemy's strength into a weakness and his own reputation for ruthlessness into a psychological weapon that often made resistance seem futile. The legacy of the Borgia family's intelligence network is a complex one. Their methods were undeniably cruel, corrupt, and self-serving, contributing to the notorious reputation of the Renaissance papacy. Yet their sheer effectiveness did not go unnoticed. Niccolò Machiavelli, who witnessed Cessair's campaigns firsthand as a Florentine diplomat, was profoundly influenced by what he saw. In his seminal work, The Prince, he holds Cessair up as the model for a new kind of ruler, one who understands that the end of securing and maintaining power justifies the means, and that a prince must be willing to emulate both the lion and the fox, using force and cunning in equal measure. The Borgias demonstrated that in a world without stable nations, where power was personal and fleeting, a dedicated intelligence apparatus was not a luxury but an absolute necessity for survival. Their story marks a pivotal point in the history of espionage, moving it from the battlefield and the royal court into the realm of personal ambition, where information became the ultimate currency for building a legacy, no matter how dark that legacy might be. Yet even as the Borgias were mastering the art of personal espionage in Italy, a different kind of intelligence operation was unfolding on a truly global scale, one whose consequences would dwarf the ambitions of any single family. The so-called discovery of the New World was not a sudden, brilliant flash of insight from a lone Genos navigator. It was the culmination of decades, even centuries, of covert information gathering, stolen knowledge, and calculated guesswork. Christopher Columbus, often portrayed as a visionary genius stumbling upon a new continent by accident, was in reality a meticulous planner whose famous voyage was built upon a foundation of geographical intelligence that was often acquired through methods indistinguishable from espionage. His journey was less a leap into the unknown and more a calculated step into a half-revealed world, pieced together from whispers in port taverns, clandestinely copied maps, and the smuggled secrets of rival empires. To understand the intelligence coup that enabled Columbus, we must look beyond Europe to the true masters of 15th century geography, Arab scholars and navigators. For centuries, while Europe was mired in its feudal struggles, the Islamic world had been the guardian of ancient knowledge and the pioneers of new discovery. In libraries from Cordoba to Baghdad, scholars had preserved and expanded upon the works of Ptolemy and other classical geographers, producing incredibly accurate maps and navigational treatises. Muslim sailors had mastered the Indian Ocean trade routes, and their knowledge of the Atlantic, particularly the wind and current patterns around the Canary Islands and down the West African coast, was far superior to that of any European power. This information was a state secret, a closely guarded asset that gave Islamic kingdoms a monopoly on the lucrative trade with the East. For a European like Columbus to acquire it required not scholarship but subterfuge. He spent years in Portugal, a hub of maritime exploration, listening intently to the tales of returning sailors, studying captured Arabic maps, and likely paying for information from informants who had access to this coveted knowledge. This was not academic research, it was industrial espionage on a civilizational scale. Columbus's own papers reveal this deep reliance on intelligence that was anything but open. He meticulously studied the works of Paolo dal Pozzo Toscanelli, a Florentine scholar who corresponded with Portuguese navigators and advocated for a westward route to Asia based on a mixture of classical texts and smuggled reports. More crucially, during his time in the Azores and Madeira, Columbus would have heard the persistent rumors among sailors of mysterious lands sighted far to the west, driftwood carved with unknown markings, unfamiliar plant species washing ashore on European beaches, and even the occasional body of a person who looked nothing like any known race. These were not just sea stories. To a man like Columbus, they were data points, fragments of intelligence that he wove into a compelling, if ultimately flawed, hypothesis. His famous miscalculation of the Earth's circumference was not mere ignorance. It was a deliberate manipulation of the available data to make his proposed journey seem more feasible to his potential backers, the Spanish crown. He was selling a vision, and his product was a dossier of carefully curated and often clandestinely acquired intelligence. The voyage itself, funded by Queen Isabella of Spain, was the execution of this intelligence-driven plan. The monarchs did not fund a blind gamble. They were investing in a mission based on a persuasive body of evidence, however misinterpreted. When Columbus set sail in 1492, he carried with him not just a royal commission, but a mental map constructed from these disparate and secret sources. He knew to drop south to the Canaries to catch the easterly trade winds that would propel him westward, a navigational secret gleaned from Portuguese and Arab sailors. His entire route was a testament to the power of applied intelligence. The subsequent Spanish conquest of the Americas followed the same pattern. Conquistadors like Cortés and Pizarro did not overwhelm vast empires with a handful of men through military superiority alone. Their success was built upon a foundation of intelligence gathered from indigenous allies who were exploited, coerced or bribed into revealing the political weaknesses, internal rivalries, and military tactics of the Aztec and Inca empires. They were masters of turning local knowledge into a weapon of conquest. The impact of this intelligence-fueled expansion is almost impossible to overstate. It was the single greatest geopolitical shift in human history. The Columbian exchanged the transfer of plants, animals, cultures, and diseases between the Old World and the new utterly transformed global demographics, economies, and diets. The flood of silver from American mines into Europe financed centuries of warfare and fueled the rise of capitalism, while also causing massive inflation. Empires in Europe were built on the wealth extracted from the Americas, and others in Africa were devastated by the slave trade that supplied labor for the new plantations. The entire global balance of power shifted westward, setting the stage for the eventual dominance of the Atlantic nations. None of this would have been possible without that initial, crucial investment in geographical espionage. The discovery of the New World, therefore, stands as the ultimate testament to the power of intelligence gathering. It demonstrates that the most world-altering events are rarely accidents of history, but are instead the direct results of a relentless, often shadowy pursuit of knowledge, a pursuit that can literally redraw the map of the world and rewrite the destiny of every continent on it. While the discovery of the New World expanded Europe's horizons geographically, a far more intimate and explosive revolution was brewing within its very soul, one that would shatter 1,000 years of religious unity and plunge the continent into over a century of sectarian war. The Protestant Reformation was not merely a theological debate conducted in scholarly Latin. It was an information war of unprecedented scale and ferocity, a battle for the hearts and minds of millions where the pulpit, the printing press, and the paid informant became the most decisive weapons. At the heart of this monumental struggle lay a sprawling, shadowy conflict fought by spies and informants for both the established Catholic Church and the burgeoning Protestant movements. Their mission was nothing less than the control of belief itself, and their clandestine activities in the early 16th century would determine the very spiritual destiny of Europe, proving that when eternal souls are the prize, espionage becomes a sacred and terrifying vocation. The spark is famously attributed to Martin Luther nailing his 95 Theses to the church door in Wittenberg in 1517. But that act alone would have remained a local academic dispute without a mechanism to spread its message. This mechanism was the underground network, a human chain of reformers, sympathizers, and covert operatives who transformed a protest into a continent-wide rebellion. Protestant spies, often operating under the guise of merchants, students, or traveling scholars, became the couriers of sedition. Their most precious cargo was not gold or weapons, but ideas, bundles of Lutheran pamphlets, smuggled Bibles translated into the vernacular, and letters of instruction from reformist leaders. These agents navigated a landscape fraught with peril, hiding contraband texts in barrels of fish, bales of cloth, or even within their own clothing, moving along established trade routes and using safe houses provided by secretly converted nobles. Their goal was to bypass the church's monopoly on information and deliver the revolutionary idea directly to the people, that salvation came through faith alone, not through the intercession of a priest or the purchase of a papal indulgence. This was espionage in the service of salvation, a dangerous game where capture could mean arrest, torture, and execution for heresy. The Catholic Church, a centuries-old institution with immense resources and a deeply ingrained tradition of vigilance against dissent, was not idle. It responded by activating its own formidable intelligence apparatus, a system refined during the Inquisition, but now expanded to meet this new, printed threat. The church's spies were everywhere, priests instructed to report on the confessions and reading habits of their parishioners, university officials monitoring the lectures of professors for any whiff of heresy, and a small army of informants embedded in printing shops and booksellers across Europe. These agents were the first line of defense, tasked with identifying the sources of Protestant literature, mapping the underground networks, and providing the names of sympathizers to the secular authorities for punishment. Their work was crucial in attempts to contain the spread, leading to public burnings of Lutheran books and making cities like Antwerp, a major printing hub, a hotbed of clandestine counter-Reformation activity. The Church understood that this was a battle of contagion, and their spies were the quarantine officers, desperately trying to burn out the infection before it spread beyond any hope of control. This shadow war profoundly influenced some of the Reformation's most pivotal public moments. The Diet of Worms in 1521, where Martin Luther was summoned to recant his teachings before the Holy Roman Emperor Charles V, was not just a theological hearing, it was a high-stakes intelligence operation. Luther's journey to Worms was safeguarded by a safe conduct pass, but both sides were maneuvering in the shadows. Protestant sympathizers within the imperial court likely provided advice and reassurance to Luther's patron, Frederick the Wise of Saxony, while Catholic spies were undoubtedly monitoring every conversation around the reformer, looking for any hint of treason or blasphemy that could be used to nullify his protection. The dramatic stand Luther took, refusing to recant unless convinced by Scripture, was a moment of very public defiance, but it was made possible by the invisible support network that had ensured his safety and spread his words, allowing him to become a symbol rather than just another anonymous heretic silenced in a dungeon. The ultimate legacy of this great ideological espionage campaign was the permanent fragmentation of Christendom. The spies and smugglers of the 16th century ensured that Protestantism was not extinguished at its source but took root in Germany, Scandinavia, England, and beyond. They created a new European reality where nations were divided by faith, a division that would lead to devastating conflicts like the 30 Years' War. Furthermore, the relentless Catholic counterintelligence efforts, while unable to stop the Reformation, eventually evolved into a more organized and proactive system, culminating in the formal establishment of the Roman Inquisition and the Index of Forbidden Books. This created a long-standing culture of surveillance and censorship within Catholic territories. The Reformation espionage networks demonstrated with brutal clarity that the most transformative revolutions are not always won on the battlefield or in the royal court, but in the quiet, dangerous work of transporting a forbidden book across a border, or in the whispered report of a spy that sends a dissident to the flames. They proved that when the soul of a civilization is at stake, the control of information becomes the highest stakes game of all, one where the victors get to write not just history but eternity itself. Imagine a diplomatic summit so extravagant its very name became a legend, a breathtaking spectacle of wealth and power designed not for war but for peace. This was the Field of the Cloth of Gold, a weeks-long festival of feasting, tournaments, and pageantry held in the summer of 1520 in a purpose-built temporary city on the border between English-held Calais and France. Here, two of Renaissance Europe's most charismatic and competitive monarchs, Henry VIII of England and Francis I of France, met with one ostensible goal: to cement a treaty of friendship and perhaps even form an alliance against their common rival, the Holy Roman Emperor Charles V. The surface of the event was a dazzling display of chivalric brotherhood. The kings jousted, wrestled, and exchanged lavish gifts. Their queens, Catherine of Aragon and Claude of France, presided over courtly dances. The tents were made of cloth of gold, a fabric woven with genuine gold thread, and wine flowed from fountains. It was, in every public sense, a monumental effort to project an image of harmony and mutual respect between the two powerful nations. Yet beneath this glittering facade, in the shadows of the pavilions and the whispers behind smiling courtesies, a very different game was being played. A high-stakes espionage operation where every toast, every tilt of the lance, and every casual conversation was a potential source of priceless intelligence. For both monarchs, this summit was the ultimate strategic opportunity disguised as a party. They arrived not just with their finest knights and most beautiful ladies, but with their most skilled intelligence operatives embedded within their retinues. These spies were not lurking figures in dark cloaks. They were perfectly camouflaged as diplomats, secretaries, priests, and even servants. Their mission was multifaceted and critically important. First and foremost, they were there to gauge the other king's true intentions. Was Francis genuinely interested in a lasting peace, or was this an elaborate ruse to buy time while he dealt with Charles V? Was Henry's boisterous camaraderie a genuine offer of friendship or a carefully constructed performance designed to mask his own ambitions? The answers to these questions would dictate foreign policy for years to come. Beyond reading intentions, the spies were tasked with a thorough assessment of the rival court's strength and wealth. The sheer opulence on display was itself a form of psychological warfare and a key data point. Agents would have been noting the quality of the horses and armor in the tournaments, the richness of the fabrics and jewels worn by the nobility, and the abundance of the food and drink. This provided a tangible measure of the kingdom's economic health and its capacity to fund a future war. A show of immense wealth could be a deterrent, suggesting a well-filled treasury for military campaigns. Conversely, any sign of cutting corners or financial strain, however well hidden, would be a crucial piece of intelligence noted for future exploitation. The methods these clandestine observers used were as subtle as the event was grand. A French diplomat sharing a flagon of wine with an English counterpart might gently steer the conversation toward the political leanings of the English nobility or the state of the royal treasury. An English clerk, assisting in the logistics of the gift exchanges, could make a mental inventory of the finest items presented by the French, assessing their value and origin. Even the seemingly frivolous tournaments were a goldmine of intelligence. The jousts and melees were not just sport, they were a live demonstration of each kingdom's martial talent. Spies would have been closely watching the skill and discipline of the knights, the quality of their steel plate armor, and the endurance of their war horses. When Henry and Francis famously wrestled each other, a moment of spontaneous and good-natured competition, you can be certain that advisors on both sides were watching not for laughs, but for clues about the other king's physical vigor, temperament, and personal courage. Every detail, from the number of retainers in a noble's train to the specific theological leanings of the accompanying chaplains, was a piece of the puzzle, gathered, analyzed, and sent back to each king's inner circle via swift messengers. The ultimate impact of this shadow war beneath the golden tents was felt not in the immediate aftermath of the summit, but in the years of diplomatic maneuvering that followed. The intelligence gathered at the Field of the Cloth of Gold did not lead to a lasting Anglo-French alliance. Instead, it provided both monarchs with a clear, first-hand assessment of the other's power and intentions, which they used to make cold, calculated strategic choices. Within just a few years, Henry VIII, perhaps convinced by his agent's reports of French strength or of Francis's untrustworthiness, abandoned the fleeting friendship and instead aligned himself with their mutual rival, Emperor Charles V, against France. The summit, for all its public displays of affection, had ultimately allowed each ruler to take the measure of the other, and decide that they were better off as rivals than as partners. The event stands as a perfect metaphor for Renaissance statecraft, where magnificent spectacle and ruthless pragmatism were two sides of the same coin. It reminds us that in the world of kings and empires, there is no such thing as a purely social occasion. Every handshake is an assessment, every smile is a mask, and every celebration is a classroom for spies, proving that the most valuable intelligence is often gathered not in the silence of an enemy camp, but in the deafening noise of a party thrown in the name of peace. Sometimes the most valuable lesson a spy can deliver is not a blueprint for victory, but a detailed post-mortem of a defeat, providing the crucial knowledge needed to succeed the next time. This was the stark reality for the vast Ottoman Empire in the autumn of 1529, as the colossal army of Sultan Suleiman the Magnificent found itself stymied before the walls of Vienna. This was the apex of Ottoman power in Europe, a force that had conquered Belgrade and crushed the Kingdom of Hungary at Mohacs just 3 years prior. Suleiman, rightly called the lawgiver by his own people and the Magnificent by a terrified Europe, now set his sights on the heart of the Habsburg Empire, the very core of Christendom. His objective was not just another city. It was a symbolic and strategic prize that would open the floodgates to the German principalities and beyond. The confidence in the Ottoman camp was palpable, but confidence is a poor substitute for accurate intelligence, especially when facing an enemy determined to fight for its very existence. The Ottoman approach to warfare was famously methodical, and their march toward Vienna was preceded by the usual cloud of scouts and agents. These operatives, many of them drawn from the Sultan's formidable network of savage military messengers and local informants in the Balkan territories, had a critical job. Their task was to map the route, identify foraging opportunities for the massive army, and most importantly, provide a clear picture of the defenses awaiting them in Vienna. The intelligence they gathered, however, was fatally compromised by two major factors: time and weather. The campaign season was dangerously advanced, slowed by unexpectedly heavy autumn rains that turned roads into quagmires and delayed the arrival of the massive siege cannons that had shattered Constantinople's walls. The reports that did come in likely offered a picture of a city that was, on paper, vulnerable. Its medieval walls were not the state-of-the-art bastions of a later era, and the garrison, though spirited, was heavily outnumbered. What the spies could not fully convey, however, was the intangible factor of Habsburg resolve. Under the command of the seasoned German mercenary Count Nicholas Graf Salm, the Viennese had undertaken a frantic but effective program of fortification, demolishing entire suburbs outside the walls to create clear fields of fire and to deny the Ottomans any cover or building materials for their siege works. This defensive determination created a reality on the ground that outdated or rushed intelligence reports failed to capture. When the siege began in late September, the limitations of the Ottoman intelligence became painfully clear. Without their heaviest artillery, their bombardments made little impact on the reinforced walls. Their attempts to dig tunnels to plant mines under the fortifications were met with aggressive countermining by the defenders, who seemed to anticipate their movements. The famously disciplined Janissaries found themselves bogged down in a bloody war of attrition in the mud and rain, facing an enemy that was well supplied, thanks to a last-minute influx of supplies and reinforcements that had slipped through before the noose tightened. The espionage failure was most acute in understanding the Habsburg supply situation. The Ottomans, relying on their vast numerical superiority, assumed that the city would be starved into submission quickly. Their spies had likely reported on grain stores from weeks prior, but they failed to account for the last-minute preparations and the defenders' ruthless rationing. As the weeks dragged on, it was the Ottoman camp, not the city, that began to feel the strain. The weather turned bitterly cold, food for the massive army grew scarce, and disease began to ravage the ranks. By mid-October, with the first snows beginning to fall and no breakthrough in sight, Suleiman was faced with a terrible choice: order a final, desperate, and costly assault that could break his army, or retreat and live to fight another day. He chose the latter, and the Ottoman host began its long, miserable withdrawal, leaving Vienna and Christendom still standing. Yet, to view the failed siege of Vienna solely as an intelligence defeat is to miss its greater significance. For the master strategists of the Ottoman court, the campaign was not a total loss. It was the most expensive and effective reconnaissance mission in history. The spies and officers who accompanied the army took meticulous notes on everything they observed. They mapped the road networks and river crossings from Constantinople to Vienna with newfound precision. They studied the new defensive techniques employed by the Habsburgs, noting the effectiveness of their countermining and their use of artillery from reinforced positions. They gathered invaluable data on the mobilization speed of German Landsknecht reinforcements and the logistics of supplying a major European city under siege. This treasure trove of operational intelligence was carried back to Istanbul and pored over for years. It informed military reforms, logistical planning, and diplomatic strategy. It taught the Ottomans that Vienna could not be taken by a rushed campaign or by overwhelming force alone. It required a more systematic approach, better supply lines, and a deeper understanding of European politics to isolate the Habsburgs from their allies. This hard-won knowledge directly shaped their strategy for the next great attempt on Vienna in 1683, over 150 years later. That second siege, while also ultimately unsuccessful, was a far more sophisticated and dangerous affair, a direct legacy of the lessons learned in 1529. This instance powerfully demonstrates that in the grand calculus of empire, there is no such thing as a wasted campaign. Even in failure, a spy's report provides the raw data for future victory, proving that the true value of intelligence is not measured in a single battle, but in the endless, patient accumulation of knowledge that defines the long game of history. While Henry VIII is often remembered for his tumultuous personal life and his break with Rome, his reign was also a masterclass in the use of domestic surveillance to crush any threat to his newfound authority. The most serious of these challenges erupted not from a foreign power or a rival noble, but from his own subjects in the remote and fiercely independent north of England. In the autumn of 1536, a massive popular uprising known as the Pilgrimage of Grace swept across Yorkshire and Lincolnshire. It was not a revolt against the king himself. The rebels professed unwavering loyalty to Henry, but against his revolutionary religious policies, the dissolution of the monasteries, the imposition of his new supreme head of the church, and the feared confiscation of parish wealth. This was a movement powered by deep faith, economic anxiety, and a profound attachment to the old ways, and it presented a threat far more insidious than any foreign army because it came from the heart of England itself. To defeat it, Henry would rely not on the blunt force of his armies, but on the sharp, precise tool of espionage turned inward. The rebellion's sheer scale was terrifying to the Tudor regime. Led by the charismatic lawyer Robert Aske, the Pilgrims assembled a force of tens of thousands of well-disciplined men, encompassing not just peasants but also lower gentry, monks, and even some discontented nobles. They adopted the banner of the 5 wounds of Christ and marched under a solemn oath to restore the Catholic Church and the monasteries, which were not just religious centers but the very bedrock of northern economic and social life. This was not a disorganized mob. It was a parallel government in motion with its own manifestos and a clear list of grievances to present to the king. Henry's initial response was a dangerous combination of bluster and bluff. He simply did not have a standing army large enough to confront the rebels directly without risking a catastrophic defeat that could inspire copycat uprisings across the entire kingdom. His only viable strategy was to play for time, to feign negotiation, and to let the powerful weapon of division do its work. And for that strategy to succeed, he needed eyes and ears inside the pilgrims' camps. This is where Henry's secret weapon came into play, a network of informants and double agents who infiltrated the rebel ranks. These operatives were likely drawn from a pool of men whose loyalties could be secured through promises of reward, threats of punishment, or simple opportunism. Some may have been minor gentry who joined the uprising initially but were later flipped by royal promises of pardon and land. Others were professional spies sent from London, skilled in the art of blending in and cultivating trust. Their mission was multifaceted and critically important. First, they were to identify the movement's leadership structure, not just the public figures like Ask, but the key captains, the financiers, and the most radical firebrands who would never accept a compromise. Second, they were to report on the rebels' military readiness, their supply lines, and the morale of the rank and file. But perhaps most importantly, they were tasked with exploiting the natural fractures within any large coalition. They would whisper doubts, magnify slights, and sow discord between the idealistic gentry, the pragmatic northern nobles, and the commoners who feared for their souls and their livelihoods. The intelligence these spies provided was the cornerstone of the Duke of Norfolk's strategy, as he led the royal delegation to negotiate with the rebels. Norfolk, representing the king, offered generous terms and a full royal pardon, promising that their grievances would be heard by a parliament to be held in York. He even gave his personal assurance of the king's good faith. This offer, made with the full knowledge that Henry had no intention of honoring it, was a masterpiece of deception built upon espionage. The spies had confirmed that the rebel host, while large, was homesick, running low on supplies, and deeply conflicted about actually fighting their king. They knew that the promise of a pardon would be irresistible to the majority who just wanted to return to their farms without being branded traitors. Trusting the king's word, the pilgrims disbanded and went home in good faith, believing they had achieved a bloodless victory. Robert Aske himself was even invited to spend Christmas at court, lulled into a fatal sense of security. The aftermath was a brutal testament to the cold efficiency of Tudor justice and the value of the intelligence that made it possible. Once the rebel army had dispersed and lost its leverage, Henry moved with ruthless speed. Using the detailed lists of ringleaders provided by his agents within the movement, he authorized a wave of arrests across the north. There would be no parliament in York, only a series of show trials and gruesome public executions intended to serve as a lasting lesson in the perils of defiance. Robert Aske was captured and hanged in chains from the walls of York Castle, left to die a slow and agonizing death as a warning to all who would challenge the royal supremacy. The pilgrimage of grace was over, crushed not by a battle but by a betrayal orchestrated from the shadows. This event marked a pivotal moment in English history, demonstrating that the Tudor state now possessed a sophisticated apparatus for internal surveillance and control. It showed that a monarch could leverage intelligence to dismantle a popular uprising from within, using promises as weapons and turning a movement's own leaders into unwitting instruments of its destruction, all without ever having to fire a shot in a pitched battle. Yet even as Henry VIII was using spies to consolidate power within his island kingdom, the Italian peninsula was demonstrating how espionage could become the very lifeblood of statecraft in a land where no single power could dominate. For much of the late 15th and early 16th centuries, Italy was not a nation but a breathtakingly beautiful and lethally competitive chessboard, a collection of wealthy, sophisticated, and perpetually squabbling city-states, each with its own army, its own ambitions, and its own network of secret agents. This was the era of the Italian Wars, a complex series of conflicts where the great powers of Europe, France, Spain, and the Holy Roman Empire came to fight their battles on Italian soil, turning the peninsula into a proxy war zone. For the native Italian states, survival in this maelstrom required a unique blend of artistic brilliance, financial acumen, and, above all, a mastery of the dark art of intelligence gathering. In a world where your ally today could be your conqueror tomorrow, information was not just power, it was the only currency that could guarantee you would see the sunrise. No state understood this better than the Republic of Venice, the Serene Republic, whose legendary intelligence service was the envy and terror of Europe. The Venetian system, centered on the Council of Ten, was a model of bureaucratic efficiency and ruthless secrecy. Their most famous operatives were their ambassadors, who were, in effect, glorified spies with diplomatic immunity. Stationed in courts across Italy and beyond, these men were required to send back detailed, encrypted reports on everything from troop movements and treaty negotiations to the gossip of the royal bedchamber and the health of a rival prince. But the true masters of the Venetian shadow world were the provveditory, military intelligence officers who accompanied armies, and a vast network of informants that included merchants, bankers, courtesans, and even priests. The Republic's wealth allowed it to simply buy the secrets it needed, creating a market for information where loyalty was always for sale to the highest bidder. A clerk in the Milanese chancery, a guard at the gates of Naples, or a servant in the Vatican, all could be persuaded to whisper a secret for a few gold ducats delivered in a dark alleyway. The value of this intelligence was demonstrated not in grand, war-winning battles, but in 1,000 daily decisions that preserved Venetian wealth and independence. A stolen letter revealing the Spanish king's intention to move his fleet might allow Venice to reroute its merchant galleys, avoiding capture and financial ruin. A report from a spy in the French court about a planned invasion of Lombardy could give the Venetian signoria precious weeks to raise mercenaries or forge a defensive alliance. Their network was so pervasive that it often felt to their rivals as if the Venetians could see the future, so perfectly did they anticipate every move against them. This allowed a relatively small city-state, with no vast hinterland to draw upon for soldiers, to punch far above its weight for centuries, outmaneuvering empires through sheer cunning and foresight. But Venice was not alone in this game. In Milan, the ruthless Sforza dynasty maintained its own formidable spy network, often focused on thwarting Venetian ambitions and managing the constant threat from its French and Habsburg neighbors. The Duke of Milan's agents were particularly skilled at military espionage, providing detailed schematics of new fortification designs and reports on the effectiveness of emerging technologies like gunpowder artillery. Meanwhile, in Florence, the de facto ruler Lorenzo de' Medici, known as Il Magnifico, used intelligence not for territorial expansion, but for maintaining a delicate balance of power that allowed the Florentine Renaissance to flourish. Lorenzo's reign was a golden age of art and learning, but it was built upon a foundation of shrewd political calculation. His network of informants, many of them bankers with branches across Europe, kept him apprised of the shifting alliances and impending wars that constantly threatened to engulf the peaceful Tuscan state. This knowledge allowed him to act as the key mediator in Italian affairs, brokering peace treaties and organizing defensive leagues that, for a time, kept the foreign wolves from the door. His patronage of Botticelli and Michelangelo was made possible precisely because his spies gave him the political stability to focus on culture instead of constant war. The ultimate tragedy of the Italian wars, however, is that this brilliant, homegrown culture of espionage eventually became its own undoing. The Italian states became so adept at their intricate dances of deception and double-dealing that they failed to recognize the true nature of their new opponents. When the colossal armies of France and Spain finally descended on the peninsula, they were not playing by the same subtle rules. The French King Charles VIII did not need to bribe a servant to learn a secret. He could simply march his terrifying Swiss mercenaries through a city's gates. The Spanish, under Ferdinand and Isabella, brought a religious fervor and a centralized state power that the fractured Italian leagues could not match. The sophisticated intelligence reports flowing into Venice and Florence began to tell a terrifying story that their rulers were powerless to stop, the story of their own inevitable conquest. The very tools that had allowed them to survive and thrive for so long, the whispered secrets, the bought allegiances, the clever treaties, were rendered obsolete by the blunt force of national armies. The Italian wars thus stand as a poignant lesson in the limits of espionage. It is the ultimate tool for managing complexity and navigating a world of equals, but it is a poor shield against an overwhelming force that does not respect the rules of the game. The spies of Renaissance Italy bought their cities time, wealth, and incredible cultural flourishing, but in the end, they could not stop the tide of history, proving that while intelligence is the key to survival in a complex world, it is no substitute for raw power when that world decides to crash down upon you. While the Italian city-states perfected espionage for survival in a fractured world, a new kind of power was rising in the heart of Europe, one that would use the same shadowy tools not to defend a city, but to assemble a global empire where the sun never set. The rise of the House of Habsburg is often summarized by a simple, famous motto: "Let others wage war, you, happy Austria, marry." This phrase suggests a peaceful, almost effortless accumulation of power through strategic weddings and lucky inheritances. But this romantic notion hides a far more calculated and gritty reality. Behind every one of those famous marriages was a small army of lawyers, diplomats, and most crucially, spies, working tirelessly to ensure that the Habsburgs weren't just lucky in love, they were impeccably informed. Their expansion from a powerful German-Austrian family to the masters of Spain, the Netherlands, half of Italy, and a vast New World empire was the greatest geopolitical jackpot in history, and it was one with a stacked deck of intelligence reports, covert influence, and psychological manipulation. The Habsburg strategy was fundamentally different from the conquests of a Genghis Khan or the subversion of an Italian prince. Their goal was not to destroy their rivals, but to absorb them, to weave their disparate territories into a seamless whole through a combination of legal claim and overwhelming administrative control. And to do that, they needed to know everything about everyone. Their intelligence network, though less famous than the Venetian system, was every bit as formidable, operating on a truly continental scale. Its operatives were the ambassadors and resident agents stationed in every major European court, from the frosty palaces of England to the opulent chambers of the Ottoman Sultan. These men were the dynasty's nervous system, sending a constant stream of encrypted dispatches back to the central court, first in Vienna and later in the sprawling bureaucratic complex of the Spanish Escorial. Their reports covered the entire spectrum of human affairs, the health of a king, a matter of supreme importance for succession planning, the size of a rival's treasury, the morale of their armies, the ambitions of their advisors, and the hidden scandals of their courtiers. This intelligence was the essential prerequisite for the famed Habsburg marriage policy. Choosing a bride or groom for a Habsburg archduke was not a matter of romance or even simple politics. It was a high-stakes corporate merger, and the due diligence was conducted by spies. Before entering into negotiations for the hand of Joanna of Castile, for instance, Habsburg agents would have provided detailed dossiers on the Spanish princess's mental state, her relationships with her parents, the Ferdinand and Isabella, and the exact terms of her inheritance. This information was what allowed Maximilian I to confidently arrange the marriage of his son, Philip the Fair, to Joanna, a union that would ultimately deliver the entire Spanish Empire to their son, Charles V. Similarly, intelligence gathered from the court of Hungary was critical in maneuvering for the succession of Louis II, who died at Mohacs, allowing the Habsburgs to press their claim and absorb Bohemia and the core of Hungary into their domains, creating a bulwark against the Ottoman advance. A wrong marital bet could bankrupt a dynasty or plunge it into a disastrous war. The Habsburgs, armed with near-perfect information, almost never bet wrong. But the network's work did not end once the marriage contracts were signed. In fact, it became even more critical. The Habsburg Empire was a sprawling, multilingual, and culturally diverse patchwork of territories, each with its own proud traditions and powerful local nobilities who often resented rule from a distant foreign court. Holding this fragile construct together required a constant, subtle application of pressure, and that pressure was guided by intelligence. Spies were deployed to monitor the mood of the nobility in the Spanish Netherlands, to uncover Protestant conspiracies in Austrian lands, and to sniff out any potential rebellion before it could gather steam. They identified which local lords could be bribed with titles and pensions, and which ones needed to be isolated and neutralized. This internal surveillance state was a key ingredient in the Habsburgs' ability to govern such a vast empire for so long, preventing the centrifugal forces of nationalism and localism from tearing it apart almost as soon as it was assembled. The ultimate testament to the power of the Habsburg intelligence machine is found not in a single battle or treaty, but in the long, stable reign of Emperor Charles V. Ruling over such a diverse and widespread collection of territories was an administrative nightmare, a constant juggling act of competing interests and imminent threats. That he managed it for nearly 40 years was a miracle of statecraft made possible by information. His ability to confront the Ottoman threat in the Mediterranean, the French Valois in Italy, and the Protestant Reformation in Germany simultaneously required an almost supernatural awareness of his enemy's capabilities and intentions. He could be in Regensburg dealing with the Lutheran princes because his spies in Istanbul had assured him the Ottoman fleet was not preparing to sail that season. He could commit resources to fighting Francis I of France because his agents in the German principalities reported that the Protestant Schmalkaldic League was too divided to act. The Habsburg spy network gave Charles V the gift of strategic patience and the ability to focus his power where it was needed most, a luxury his rivals rarely enjoyed. Their rise was not a simple story of fortunate marriages. It was the story of a dynasty that understood that to win an empire through diplomacy, you must first conquer the world of information, proving that the most powerful throne in 16th century Europe was built not on gold or steel, but on a foundation of countless, carefully gathered secrets. Yet, even as the Habsburgs were leveraging their intelligence network to bind a continent-spanning empire together, the very world they sought to rule was undergoing a profound transformation. The clear lines between the medieval and the modern were beginning to blur, and the shadowy art of espionage was evolving in step, adapting its ancient techniques to meet the challenges of a new age. The final years of the 15th century and the dawn of the 16th represent a fascinating bridge in the history of intelligence, a period where the last truly medieval spies operated using time-honored methods, even as they laid the groundwork for the sophisticated state-sponsored espionage of the Renaissance. Their actions during this pivotal transition, particularly in the long, grinding conclusion of the 100 Years' War and the fierce campaign to unify Spain, demonstrate that the lessons of medieval spycraft were not abandoned but rather refined, creating a direct lineage from the whispered secrets of feudal courts to the encrypted dispatches of early modern diplomacy. Consider the final chapter of the 100 Years' War, a conflict that had ravaged France for over a century. By the 1450s, the English hold on the continent had been reduced to a sliver of territory around the city of Calais, but the French drive for total victory was far from assured. The war had become a complex struggle of sieges and attrition, and the key to breaking the last pockets of English resistance often lay not in pitched battles, but in the patient work of intelligence. French agents, likely employing the same methods used centuries earlier to take Château Gaillard, would have been tasked with infiltrating English-held towns. Disguised as merchants or itinerant laborers, they sought out the same human vulnerabilities: a disgruntled garrison captain unhappy with his pay, a local baker fearful of a long siege, or a corrupt official willing to look the other way for a bag of silver. The information they provided about supply levels, morale, and the physical condition of the walls allowed the French King Charles VII to apply pressure with surgical precision, accepting surrenders without costly assaults and systematically erasing the English presence from the map. This was medieval spycraft in its purest form, but it was now being executed with a bureaucratic efficiency that hinted at the modern intelligence agencies to come, proving that the principles of human intelligence remained timeless even as the world changed around them. Simultaneously, on the Iberian Peninsula, a different kind of war was reaching its climax, one that would also rely heavily on the shadow work of intelligence. The Reconquista, the centuries-long campaign to drive the Muslim Moors from Spain, found its final act in the conquest of the Emirate of Granada. The Catholic monarchs Ferdinand and Isabella understood that to defeat the fortified mountain redoubts of the last Moorish ruler, Boabdil, they needed more than just the courage of their knights. They needed eyes inside the Alhambra Palace itself. Their agents were a diverse group, including conversos, Jewish converts to Christianity, who could move between cultures, Moorish soldiers disillusioned with Boabdil's rule, and Christian merchants who had traded within Granada for years. These operatives provided Ferdinand with a constant stream of intelligence on the deepening political divisions within the city, the crippling food shortages caused by the Spanish blockade, and the wavering loyalty of Boabdil's own commanders. This information was crucial. It allowed the Spanish to tighten their siege relentlessly, knowing exactly when the defenders were at their weakest, and it provided the ammunition for a parallel psychological campaign, encouraging defections and sowing despair. The eventual surrender of Granada in 1492 was a military and political triumph, but it was also a monumental intelligence victory, the culmination of a spy network that had systematically dismantled an enemy's will to resist from the inside out. What makes these last medieval spies so significant is not just their success, but how they began to institutionalize their craft. The Catholic monarchs, for instance, formalized the use of diplomatic couriers and created a more structured postal service, which doubled as a secure channel for intelligence reports. The chaotic, freelance espionage of earlier eras was gradually being replaced by a more professionalized system, directly in the service of the burgeoning nation-state. The tools were also evolving. While still reliant on human sources, the use of complex ciphers and codes, once the domain of only the most sophisticated players like the Venetians, became more widespread. The rise of the printing press, meanwhile, created a new battlefield, the world of propaganda and counter-information, where controlling the narrative became as important as stealing battle plans. The legacy of these transitional figures is immense. They provided the blueprint for the great intelligence services of the 16th and 17th centuries. The methods they refined, the running of double agents, the systematic debriefing of sources, the use of diplomacy as a cover for espionage, would be adopted and expanded by everyone from Queen Elizabeth I's spymaster Sir Francis Walsingham to the cardinal ministers of Bourbon, France. They proved that espionage was not a peripheral activity for times of war, but a central pillar of statecraft, essential for the security and expansion of the modern nation-state. The medieval spy, operating in a world of parchment and pilgrims, thus handed down a priceless inheritance to the early modern world, a thorough understanding that knowledge is the ultimate source of power, and that the quiet, patient work of gathering secrets in the shadows is what truly builds and protects the empires we see in the light. From the thunderous Norman conquest that rewrote the language of England to the silent, patient intelligence that fueled the voyages connecting entire continents, these 23 stories reveal a truth far more fascinating than any fiction. The grand narrative of the medieval world was not written solely by kings and armies on sunlit battlefields, but equally by unseen figures moving through shadowed corridors, bustling marketplaces, and moonlit encampments. These operatives, whether a disgruntled Saxon noble whispering to William, a Venetian ambassador meticulously encoding a report, or a Borgia agent slipping poison into a rival's cup, understood a fundamental principle that still governs our world today: that information is the ultimate currency of power. They wielded it with a breathtaking audacity that toppled thrones, defended faiths, and redrew the very maps of nations, proving that a single, well-placed secret could be more decisive than the charge of 10,000 knights. What these tales collectively teach us is a profound lesson in the enduring architecture of power itself. The methods have evolved from hidden messages in hollowed-out staves to encrypted digital signals whirling through satellites, but the core game remains unchanged. It is a perpetual contest between those who seek to guard their secrets and those who are desperate to learn them, a dance of deception and discovery that plays out in every era. The medieval spy's toolkit, the cultivation of human sources, the exploitation of an enemy's internal divisions, the weaponization of propaganda, and the strategic elimination of a key leader, are all chapters in a playbook still studied and employed by modern intelligence agencies. The fragility of trust that William Wallace experienced from Sir John de Menteith, the power of cultural understanding that fueled the Mongol conquests, and the use of subterfuge to bypass impregnable walls like those of Château Gaillard. These are not quaint historical footnotes. They are timeless case studies in the art of gaining an advantage. Perhaps the most astonishing revelation is how these clandestine acts, committed by individuals whose names are almost entirely lost to history, created ripple effects that shaped the modern world in ways we are still unraveling. The intelligence that enabled the fall of Constantinople didn't just end an empire. It forced Europe to look westward, accelerating an age of exploration that would accidentally stumble upon the Americas. The espionage that secured the Habsburg dynastic marriages didn't just combine territories. It forged a superpower that dictated European politics for 2 centuries. The whispers that crushed the Pilgrimage of Grace didn't just reaffirm Tudor authority. They helped cement the course of the English Reformation, altering the religious landscape forever. A decision made in a hidden chamber based on a spy's report could set in motion events that would echo for a millennium, proving that history often turns on its smallest, most secret hinges. As we close this chapter on these shadowy architects of the past, it's worth turning our gaze to the present. the digital age has not made espionage obsolete. It has simply relocated the battlefield to a new frontier. The social media platforms we scroll through, the global financial networks that move our money, and the critical infrastructure that powers our cities are all now arenas for a new kind of information warfare. While the tools are light years removed from a coded message baked into a loaf of bread, the objectives remain strikingly familiar: stealing secrets, influencing populations, sabotaging rivals, and protecting national interests. The medieval spies who infiltrated a court or a castle would instantly recognize the underlying principles of a modern cyber attack or a disinformation campaign. The goal is always to see what your opponent keeps hidden and to shield your own vulnerabilities. We've journeyed through centuries of astonishing stories, from the sands of the Holy Land to the misty highlands of Scotland. Now we want to hear from you. Which of these 23 history-altering spies left you the most amazed? Was it the patient agents who found the fatal weakness in the walls of Constantinople, or the treacherous betrayal that brought down the heroic William Wallace? Perhaps it was Eleanor of Aquitaine wielding her network from a prison cell, or the anonymous Mongols whose reports built the largest land empire in history. Share your favorite story and your thoughts in the comments below. Let's keep the conversation going. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the secret history that shaped our world, make sure you don't miss out on future explorations. Subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell so you're always in the know when we upload new content. We're constantly unearthing forgotten narratives and uncovering the hidden forces behind the events you thought you knew. Your support helps us bring these incredible stories to light. Until our next adventure into the past, remember the lesson written in whispers across 1,000 years of history. Never underestimate the power of a well-kept secret, for it is often the quietest moments hidden from the history books that truly change the world. If this journey into the shadowy world of medieval spies has ignited your curiosity, there are so many incredible ways to keep exploring this fascinating subject. For a truly immersive dive, nothing quite compares to the words of those who lived it. Primary sources like the Chronicles of Froissart, who documented the 100 Years' War with a keen eye for intrigue, or the letters and state papers of monarchs like Edward I, which are filled with cryptic references to payments for certain secret business. For a masterful modern analysis that connects all the dots, I cannot recommend enough The Medieval Spy by the historian James Given. It's an absolutely captivating read that lays out the entire ecosystem of espionage in a way that's both scholarly and incredibly accessible. But the adventure doesn't stop on the page. Many major museums, like the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York or the British Museum in London, have extensive medieval collections where you can stand before the actual armor, weapons, and everyday objects these figures would have used, making the history feel instantly tangible. And for those who prefer to explore from home, countless digital archives and university websites now offer high-resolution scans of medieval manuscripts, allowing you to scrutinize the very documents that might have once carried coded messages. I am so eager to hear which of these 23 stories resonated most with you. Was it the betrayal of Wallace, the cunning of Eleanor of Aquitaine, or perhaps the fall of Château Gaillard? Let me know in the comments below what other historical mysteries you'd love for us to uncover next, whether it's the secret codes of the Renaissance or the unsolved crimes of the ancient world. And if you want to join a community of fellow history enthusiasts for deeper discussions and exclusive content, be sure to subscribe and hit the notification bell. Remember, the pursuit of knowledge is the most thrilling adventure of all, and as these medieval masters of deception proved, the most valuable truths are often hidden in the most unexpected places, waiting for a curious mind to